welcome. Wherever you are right now, whether you are settled in for the night or simply looking for somewhere quiet to rest your thoughts, this is a good place to be. Tell us where you are listening from and what time it is. Tonight, we are going to spend some time with one of the most unhurried animals on Earth. An animal that does almost everything slowly. An animal that, by its very nature, seems to resist urgency in all its forms. We are going to talk about the sloth. Over the next few hours, we will move through everything there is to know about this animal. From the forests of Central and South America, where it makes its home, to the slow turning of its days and nights in the canopy. We will look at what it eats, how it moves, how it rests, how it raises its young, and how its kind has existed on this planet for tens of millions of years. There is no rush. There is no destination to reach. Each section of this recording stands on its own, which means that if you drift away at any point, that is perfectly fine. The information will still be here when you return, or when you need it again some other night. Let the pace of this recording slow you down a little. Let the image of an animal hanging quietly in the canopy, in the warm green air of a tropical forest, be something your mind can settle into. We begin now, gently and without hurry, with the sloth. The sloth is a mammal. It lives in trees. It moves very slowly. These are the first three things most people learn about the sloth, and while they are all true, they only begin to describe what this animal actually is. Sloths belong to a group of mammals called Xenarthra, a name that refers to certain unusual features of their vertebral column. This same group also includes armadillos and anteaters. If that seems like an unusual combination of animals, it is worth noting that Xenarthra is one of the oldest lineages of placental mammals in existence. The group is believed to have originated in South America, roughly 60 million years ago, during a period when that continent was entirely isolated from the rest of the world. Within Xenarthra, sloths occupy a suborder called Folivora, a word that relates to their leaf-eating habits. They are also grouped under the order Pelosa, which they share with anteaters. The name Pelosa means hairy, a reference to the thick coats that both groups of animals carry. There are 6 living species of sloth, and they fall into 2 distinct families. The first family, Bradypotidae, contains the 3-toed sloths, 4 species in total. The second family, Megalonychida, contains the 2-toed sloths, 2 species. Despite sharing the name sloth and looking broadly similar, these 2 families are not especially close relatives. Genetic evidence suggests they evolved their shared characteristics, their tree-dwelling habits, their slowness, their curved claws, independently of each other. Scientists describe this as convergent evolution. 2 separate lineages arriving at similar solutions through different paths. All 6 species live in the lowland tropical forests of Central and South America. They do not exist anywhere else in the wild. Their biology is so finely tuned to that specific environment, its warmth, its particular trees, its stable climate, that they have not spread beyond it. In terms of physical appearance, sloths are medium-sized animals. They typically measure between 50 and 75 centimeters in length, and most species weigh somewhere between 4 and 8 kilograms, roughly the size and weight of a small cat or a large rabbit. Their fur is coarse and brownish gray, with an outer layer of longer guard hairs that often develops a greenish tint in humid conditions. Their heads are small and rounded, with flat snouts, small ears, and large, somewhat forward-facing eyes. Their limbs are long relative to their bodies, and their feet end in long, curved claws, 2 on the front feet of two-toed sloths, 3 on all 4 feet of three-toed sloths. Those claws are central to everything about the sloth's life. They are not primarily tools for digging or defending, though they can serve those purposes. They are, above all, hooks. The sloth spends most of its life hanging from branches, and the claws hold it there with minimal muscular effort. In this way, the sloth is essentially built around a single structural principle, staying aloft in the trees with as little energy as possible. This is a theme that will return again and again as we explore the life of the sloth. Almost everything about this animal, its slowness, its diet, its body temperature, its sleeping habits, its digestive system, connects back to the same underlying logic. The sloth has become extraordinarily efficient at existing on very little. Sloths are found across a broad but specific region. Their range covers the lowland tropical forests of Central America, countries like Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and Honduras, and extends south through the upper and western portions of South America, including Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and large parts of Brazil. Within Brazil, different species occupy different zones. The brown-throated three-toed sloth, which is the most widely distributed of all sloth species, ranges widely across the northern and central portions of the country. The manned three-toed sloth, by contrast, is confined to the Atlantic forest, a distinct and ecologically separate rainforest ecosystem that runs along Brazil's eastern coastline. In Panama, there's a small island called Isla Escudo de Veraguas, located off the Caribbean coast. This island is home to a single species found nowhere else on Earth, the pygmy three-toed sloth. This animal is smaller than all its relatives, and it lives almost exclusively in the red mangrove trees that line the island's shoreline. Because it is restricted to such a small area, the pygmy three-toed sloth is currently classified as critically endangered. The habitat shared by most sloth species is the tropical rainforest canopy. This is a world of layered vegetation, permanent warmth, and high humidity. Temperatures in these forests remain relatively stable throughout the year, typically ranging somewhere between 22 and 30 degrees Celsius, depending on location and altitude. Rainfall is abundant, often falling every day, or nearly every day in the wetter months. The air is dense with moisture, and the forest itself is thick. Multiple overlapping layers of vegetation from the forest floor to the upper canopy, more than 30 meters above the ground. Sloths live primarily in the upper and middle layers of this canopy. They tend to favor emergent trees, those that grow tall enough to rise above the surrounding canopy and receive direct sunlight. This preference is partly about warmth. As we will explore more fully later, the sloth has an unusual relationship with body temperature and often needs to bask in sunlight to regulate its internal heat. Within their home range, individual sloths tend to concentrate their activity around a relatively small number of trees. They have what researchers sometimes call a modal tree, a single tree they return to most often and spend the most time in. They may visit several neighboring trees over the course of weeks or months. but the mottled tree functions as a kind of anchor point. When a sloth descends to the ground, something it does only rarely, it typically does so at the base of that same tree. The trees sloths favor most are those with broad, accessible crowns and branches that can be reached by moving slowly along vines and connecting limbs. They are not gymnasts of the forest in the way that monkeys are. They navigate the canopy by a kind of deliberate, methodical movement, reaching, gripping, pulling, one limb at a time. Different sloth species show slightly different habitat preferences. Three-toed sloths of the genus Bradipus are closely associated with cecropia trees, a fast-growing pioneer species found throughout much of the neotropical region, especially in disturbed areas and forest edges. Two-toed sloths are generally less selective in their tree choices and will feed from a wider variety of species. It is worth pausing here to appreciate the scale of the world these animals inhabit. The neotropical rainforest is one of the most biologically rich environments on Earth. The Amazon basin alone covers more than 5.5 million square kilometers. The forests of Central America, though smaller, are extraordinarily dense with life. In these environments, sloths are not rare or marginal animals. They are among the most common mid-sized mammals. On Barrow, Colorado Island in Panama, a well-studied research site in the middle of the Panama Canal, sloths have been estimated to account for roughly 70% of the total biomass of arboreal mammals. They are, in the canopy they occupy, a major presence. A sloth's day is, in most observable respects, a day of stillness. The animal spends the majority of its time hanging from a branch or wedged into the fork of a tree in a state of rest. It sleeps for somewhere between 15 and 20 hours out of every 24. During the waking hours that remain, it moves slowly through the canopy, feeds on leaves and buds, and then returns to rest again. This pattern is not laziness in any meaningful sense. It is a physiological strategy. The sloth survives on a diet that provides very little caloric energy, primarily leaves, which are nutritionally sparse and difficult to digest. To match its intake, the sloth has reduced its energy expenditure to the minimum required to sustain life. It sleeps more than most mammals. It moves less than almost any other mammal of comparable size. Its heart beats slowly. Its body temperature is lower than average for a mammal. Every system in its body runs at a reduced pace. The result is an animal that appears, to a human observer, to be almost motionless, and in some hours of the day, it genuinely is. A sloth may remain entirely still for several hours at a time, hanging in the canopy with its claws locked around a branch, eyes closed, body temperature dropping. Sloths are primarily nocturnal, though the term is somewhat loose in their case. Many individuals are active during the cooler hours of the early morning and late afternoon, as well as the night, particularly when it comes to feeding. During the warmest parts of the day, they tend to rest. They may position themselves in sunlit branches to absorb warmth, particularly if the night has been cool. Movement, when it occurs, is deliberate and sequential. A sloth moves one limb at a time, reaching forward or sideward to grip a new branch before releasing the one behind. On flat ground, which sloths rarely visit, they're even slower, dragging themselves along with their forelimbs because their hind legs are not built for upright walking. On the ground, a sloth is largely helpless in the sense that it cannot walk normally. It crawls. It pulls itself forward. Its maximum speed on the ground is roughly 1 to 2 meters per minute. In the canopy, though the speed is still low, typically less than a kilometer per hour, the sloth is in its element. It can navigate complex branch structures, cross gaps between trees by reaching across vines, and descend or ascend a trunk with slow but steady progress. One of the more counterintuitive aspects of sloth behavior is their capacity in water. Sloths are competent swimmers. If they encounter a river or flooded area, they will enter the water and swim using a kind of diagonal pull of the forelimbs. In water, they can actually move 3 times faster than they do on the ground. They have been observed crossing rivers voluntarily, and sloth populations that live near water may use swimming as a way to access new areas or find mates. Feeding happens mostly at night. The sloth reaches for nearby leaves, buds, and stems from whatever position it occupies, taking small bites slowly. It does not pursue its food the way many animals do. It simply consumes what is within reach from where it rests. Then it moves a short distance and rests again. This pattern repeats through the night in a slow, rhythmic way. One notable behavior that recurs on a roughly weekly schedule is the sloth's descent to the ground for defecation. Most of what the sloth produces in the way of waste it deposits at the base of its motile tree, in a shallow scrape in the ground, or among the leaf litter. This journey, from the canopy to the ground and back again, takes a significant toll on the animal in energy terms. It exposes the sloth to ground-level predators during the time it spends on the forest floor. And yet sloths have maintained this behavior consistently. Researchers have proposed several explanations, which we will return to in a later section, but the behavior itself is one of the most reliably observed patterns in sloth life. Between these periodic ground visits, feeding sessions, and periods of basking, the hours of the sloth's day are filled primarily with sleep. Long, uninterrupted, deep sleep. The branches of the canopy hold the sloth in place while it rests, its claws forming a passive lock that requires no sustained muscular effort. In this suspended position, the sloth may sleep through storms, through the calls of birds, through the movements of other animals in the same tree. It is, in every sense, an animal designed around the idea of stillness. The sloth's body is one of the more specialized structures in the mammalian world. Almost every aspect of its physiology reflects a single overarching adaptation: surviving on leaves. Leaves are an abundant food source. They are available year-round in tropical forests and require no hunting or chasing. But they are also low in protein, low in calories, and often filled with chemical compounds that plants produce to deter animals from eating them. Tannins, alkaloids, and other secondary metabolites that are, in varying degrees, toxic. Sloths have evolved several mechanisms to deal with these challenges. Their stomachs are large, multi-chambered organs that work like slow fermentation chambers. Symbiotic bacteria living in the stomach help break down the tough plant fibers and neutralize some of the toxic compounds. The entire digestive process is prolonged. A single meal may take several days to move through the system, and in some cases may require close to a week. The stomach at any given time may contain material that constitutes up to 30% of the sloth's body weight. Because digestion is so slow, sloths eat very little at a time. They do not consume large quantities of food in a single sitting. Instead, They take small amounts over the course of each feeding period, allowing the stomach to process what is already there before adding more. The metabolic rate of a sloth, the rate at which its body converts food to energy, is unusually low. It runs at roughly 40 to 45% of what would be expected for a mammal of similar body weight. This means the sloth processes energy slowly and requires far less of it than most comparable animals. This is the physiological basis for nearly all of its behavioral characteristics. The slowness of movement, the long sleep periods, the infrequent defecation, all of these reduce energy expenditure to match the limited energy the sloth extracts from its food. Body temperature is another area where the sloth is unusual. Most mammals maintain a stable internal temperature through metabolic heat production. Sloths do this less effectively. Their body temperature fluctuates more than most mammals, ranging from roughly 25 to 35 degrees Celsius, depending on the ambient temperature and time of day. This variability is an energy-saving strategy. Maintaining a constant, high body temperature costs energy, and the sloth does not have that energy to spare. Instead, the sloth behaves somewhat like a reptile in this regard, warming itself by basking in sunlight when cool and retreating to shade when warm. The reduced muscle mass of the sloth is another notable adaptation. Sloths possess approximately 30% of the muscle mass, typical for a mammal of their size. This seems counterintuitive for an animal that hangs from branches all day. But the key insight is that the sloth's claws and the structure of its grip are passive. The tendons and claw geometry maintain the grip without sustained muscular contraction. A sloth can remain locked onto a branch while fully asleep. Muscles are not required for this. The reduced muscle mass saves energy and reduces the caloric demand the body places on itself. The fur of the sloth is also adapted in an unusual direction. In most mammals, hairs grow outward toward the extremities, from the body surface toward the tips of the limbs. In sloths, this direction is reversed. The hairs grow from the belly toward the back, from the limbs toward the body. This is understood to be an adaptation to the sloth's inverted posture. Hanging upside down is the sloth's default orientation, and hairs that grow away from the extremities in this position will channel rain and debris downward, off the animal's body. The surface of those hairs is also distinctive. Each strand has fine longitudinal grooves running along it. These grooves provide purchase for microscopic algae, primarily species of Trichophilus and Cyanoderma, single-celled organisms that colonize the fur and give it a faint greenish tint in humid conditions. This coloration helps the sloth blend into its leafy surroundings. But the relationship between sloth and algae may be more than cosmetic. Some researchers have proposed that sloths ingest algae during grooming, gaining a supplementary nutritional benefit from the organisms living on their own fur. This ecological relationship, the sloth as a living substrate for algae, is part of a broader pattern. The fur of a sloth is an ecosystem in miniature. In addition to algae, it hosts species of moths, beetles, ticks, and mites. Some moth species, known as sloth moths, are found nowhere else. They live their entire adult lives in sloth fur, feeding on the algae and laying their eggs in the sloth's fecal deposits. When the larvae mature, they fly back up to the sloth. The relationship appears to be mutualistic. The moths may actually help the algae grow by introducing nutrients, and the algae benefit the sloth through camouflage and potentially through nutrition. The result is that a single sloth moving slowly through the canopy is not just an individual animal, it is a mobile habitat, supporting a community of other organisms that could not exist without it. Sloths are, in their daily lives, largely solitary animals. A single sloth occupies a home range of roughly 10 acres, though ranges vary by species, sex, and the productivity of the forest. Within this range, it will encounter other sloths from time to time. A neighbor passing through the same section of canopy, or an individual at a shared food tree. But these encounters are generally passive. Sloths do not form groups or travel together. They do not appear to maintain social bonds in the way that many mammals do. Male sloths are particularly independent. A male's core area typically overlaps with the ranges of several females, but males do not appear to monitor or defend access to those females outside of mating opportunities. They generally tolerate the presence of neighboring males, particularly those that appear to be relatives, and direct aggression is not commonly observed. Female sloths are somewhat more social than males by comparison. Females sometimes congregate loosely, feeding in the same trees, resting in proximity, without the aggressive interactions that might occur between territorial male mammals. The degree of social tolerance among females has been observed in several study populations, though the underlying reasons are not fully established. Communication between sloths relies primarily on scent. Both sexes have scent glands in the anal region, and they mark branches and tree trunks by rubbing against them. These scent marks carry information about the individual's identity and reproductive status. A sloth moving through the canopy can assess these marks and adjust its behavior accordingly, moving toward a potential mate or avoiding a well-established neighbor. Three-toed sloths have an additional form of communication: vocalization. Females of the three-toed species produce a high-pitched call, sometimes described as a whistle or a thin, prolonged cry, to signal reproductive availability. This call carries through the forest and can attract males from some distance. Two-toed sloths do not vocalize in this way for reproductive purposes and rely more heavily on scent. Outside of reproductive contexts, sloths are generally quiet. They can produce hissing sounds if disturbed or handled. A distressed sloth may make a low moaning sound, but in normal daily life, they are silent animals. The forest around them may be full of sound: birds, insects, frogs, the wind in the canopy, but the sloth contributes little to it. Territory in the strict sense does not seem to apply to sloths in the way it does to many mammals. Home ranges overlap, and sloths do not actively exclude others from their areas. What they maintain is a preference for familiar trees and roots through the canopy, a kind of spatial habit rather than a defended boundary. Over time, an individual sloth develops an intimate knowledge of its small piece of forest, where the best food trees are, which branches connect to which, where the sun reaches the canopy, at what hours of the day. This local knowledge accumulates slowly over years, and may be one reason why sloths are so poorly equipped to relocate after habitat disruption. A sloth that is forced to leave its familiar territory must navigate entirely unfamiliar forest, find new food sources, and re-establish the spatial knowledge it has spent years developing, all at the pace of an animal that moves through the canopy at less than 1 kilometer per hour. Reproduction in sloths is a slow process, consistent with nearly everything else about their biology. Among three-toed sloths, mating occurs seasonally, typically during specific months that vary by location and species. The manned three-toed sloth is an exception, breeding year-round. Two-toed sloths also breed without strong seasonal restriction. The signaling that brings males and females together differs between the two families, as we have already noted. Vocalization for three-toed sloths. Scent marking for two-toed sloths. When males compete for access to a female, the contest takes place in the canopy. Males use their claws and bite at rivals, attempting to dislodge the opponent from the branch. The fights are slow motion by most standards. Neither combatant moves quickly, but they can be sustained and result in real injury. The winner mates with the female, though females are not strictly monogamous and may mate with multiple males in a single breeding season. Gestation, the period from fertilization to birth, varies between species and is not always precisely known. For three-toed sloths, it is approximately 6 months. For two-toed sloths, the gestation period is longer, somewhere between 10 and 12 months. In both cases, a single offspring is the norm. Twins occur, but are uncommon, and twin pregnancies rarely result in 2 surviving young. The newborn sloth is notably well developed at birth. Unlike the young of many mammals, a sloth infant is born with its eyes open, its claws already formed, and the muscular strength needed to grip its mother's fur. This is important because the infant must immediately attach itself to the mother and hold on. It makes its way from the birth position to its mother's chest or abdomen, where it will remain for several months. The mother nurses her young for a relatively brief period, a matter of weeks to a few months, depending on species. But she continues to carry the infant on her body long after weaning. Young sloths remain with their mothers for 6 months to a year, clinging to her fur, sleeping when she sleeps, feeding on nearby leaves they can reach from their position on her body. This extended contact serves several purposes. The infant is protected, kept warm, and is learning by proximity and by direct imitation which leaves are safe to eat and which trees to use. The learning of diet is an important process for young sloths. The tropical forest contains many plant species, and a significant proportion of them produce chemical compounds that are harmful in large quantities. An adult sloth has developed both a physiological tolerance and a behavioral knowledge of which plants are suitable. The young sloth begins this process by licking around the mother's mouth after she feeds, sampling the residue of her meal. Over time, through this slow apprenticeship, the infant develops its own dietary preferences and tolerances. When the young sloth eventually separates from its mother, typically at around 1 year of age, it inherits a portion of her home range. The area the mother occupied becomes divided, in a sense, between the two animals. The young sloth takes over a portion of the familiar territory, including some of the food trees it learned with its mother. This is one mechanism by which knowledge of the local environment passes from one generation to the next. Sexual maturity in sloths is reached at approximately 1 to 2 years of age in females and somewhat later in males. but reproductive activity often begins later than maturity. In populations where food resources are limited, females may not breed every year. A typical female two-toed sloth in the wild may produce one offspring every 1 to 2 years throughout her reproductive life. The lifespan of wild sloths is not precisely known for most species. In managed care, two-toed sloths can live into their late 20s and even beyond. The oldest recorded sloth in captivity lived to approximately 49 years. Wild lifespans are likely shorter due to predation, disease, and environmental stress, but sloths are believed to be relatively long-lived compared to other mammals of their size. Sloths are, in some respects, surprisingly resilient animals. Their slow physiology, which might seem to be a vulnerability, turns out to confer some notable advantages when it comes to injury and disease. Sloths have been documented recovering from injuries that would be serious or fatal for many other animals. Deep bite wounds, lacerations from predators, or falls. These can heal relatively quickly in sloths, often within a month, and rarely seem to become infected. The reasons for this are not entirely clear. Some researchers have proposed that the sloth's low body temperature, cooler than the optimal growth temperature for many pathogens, may reduce infection risk. Others have noted that the microbial community living in sloth fur may have properties that inhibit bacterial growth, though this remains an area of active research. The sloth's variable body temperature, while an adaptation to its energy budget, also creates a vulnerability. In cool or wet conditions, when the animal cannot warm itself adequately, its metabolic rate can fall to the point where digestion slows severely or stalls. A sloth caught in extended cold or heavy rain without access to sunlight can enter a state of torpor, a deep physiological inactivity from which it may be slow to recover. If conditions persist, this can become life-threatening. Predation is a constant background pressure for sloths, though their primary defense, stillness and camouflage, is effective enough that they are not frequently taken. The main predators of sloths in the canopy are harpy eagles and other large birds of prey that hunt by sight. On the ground, jaguars and ocelots pose the primary risk. Because sloths are relatively helpless on the ground, the periodic descent for defecation is genuinely a moment of heightened vulnerability. Parasites are abundant in sloth fur. The community of moths, beetles, mites, and ticks that lives on the sloth is, as we have noted, largely mutualistic or neutral in its effects, but heavy parasite loads can affect individual animals, and some organisms do cause harm. Among documented causes of mortality in wild sloths, human-related factors now constitute a significant portion. In Costa Rica, which has one of the more studied sloth populations, a major cause of death for sloths is contact with electrical infrastructure. Sloths moving through disturbed habitat, where trees have been cleared and power lines run through formerly forested areas, will attempt to use power lines as pathways between tree fragments. The result is often fatal. Sloths do not perceive the danger of electrical current, and the slow, deliberate grip they use when moving means they often maintain contact with live cables longer than other animals might. Road crossings present a similar hazard. Sloths attempting to move through fragmented habitat must sometimes cross open ground between forest patches. In areas with heavy road traffic, this becomes dangerous. Sloths on the ground move slowly enough that they cannot reliably avoid vehicles. In the absence of human-related hazards, the natural lifespan of a sloth appears to be substantial. The combination of effective camouflage, passive grip that allows sleep without falling, and physiological resilience to injury creates conditions for a long life, even in a competitive and predator-rich environment. The sloth achieves longevity not through speed or strength or acute senses, but through the quiet virtue of being very difficult to notice. To understand sloths fully, it helps to move backward in time, quite a long way backward. The group of mammals to which sloths belong, Xenarthra, is estimated to have separated from the common ancestor of all placental mammals somewhere between 60 and 100 million years ago. For most of the subsequent period, this lineage evolved in isolation. South America was, for many millions of years, an island continent, separated from North America and from the rest of the world's land masses. The Xenarthra diversified in this isolation, developing forms unlike those found anywhere else. Sloths themselves, as a distinct lineage, appear in the fossil record approximately 35 million years ago. The earliest sloths were terrestrial animals, ground dwellers. They were not the slow, hanging creatures of today. They walked on four legs or possibly reared up on their hind legs to reach vegetation. And over the subsequent tens of millions of years, this lineage produced a remarkable variety of forms. The ground sloths were, in many cases, enormous. Megatherium americanum, one of the best-known ancient sloths, is estimated to have weighed approximately 4 tons. It would have stood taller than most modern horses when upright. Other species were smaller, but still far larger than any living sloth. Mylodon darwinii, named for Charles Darwin, who encountered its fossil remains during his voyage on the Beagle, was roughly the size of a large ox. Jefferson's ground sloth, Megalonyx jeffersoni, ranged across North America as far as Alaska and was approximately the size of a bull. Thomas Jefferson himself described a fossil of this species in a scientific paper in 1797, making it one of the earliest American contributions to paleontology. These ground sloths spread widely. From their South American origin, they eventually reached North America before the formation of the Isthmus of Panama, by a route that likely involved some capacity for island hopping across ocean gaps. Some species also reached the Caribbean islands, where a distinct radiation of smaller sloths developed. All of these ground sloths went extinct. The timing of their disappearance correlates closely with the arrival of human hunters in the Americas, approximately 12,000 years ago. The extent to which humans directly caused their extinction, as opposed to climate shifts at the end of the last ice age, remains a matter of scientific discussion. What is clear is that within a relatively short period, all the large-bodied sloths on the American continents disappeared. What survived were the small-bodied, tree-dwelling forms, the ancestors of today's 6 species. The 2 living families of sloths, Bradypodidae and Megalonychidae, are not as closely related as their shared name and similar appearance might suggest. Molecular and paleontological evidence indicates that the 2- and 3-toed sloths evolved their arboreal lifestyle independently from different terrestrial lineages. The similarities between them, the long curved claws, the inverted posture, the slow metabolism, evolved in a parallel. This is one of the more striking examples of convergent evolution known among mammals. Today's 6 species represent only a small fraction of the diversity that once existed in the sloth lineage. The fossil record has yielded evidence of more than 100 genera of sloths across 8 families. The current 6 species, spread across 2 families, are survivors of an event that eliminated almost 90% of sloth diversity at the end of the Pleistocene. Viewed through this lens, the sloth hanging motionless in the canopy of an Amazonian forest is a remnant, not of a simple lineage, but of an extraordinarily diverse and successful evolutionary history that once filled the Americas with animals of all sizes. The genetic relationships among living sloths have been studied with increasing precision in recent years. Ancient DNA extracted from fossil specimens has allowed researchers to build phylogenetic trees that include both extinct and living forms. These analyses have overturned some earlier assumptions based on bone morphology alone, and the full picture of how the living species relate to their fossil relatives continues to be refined. The word sloth is an Old English word. Its root is the Old English sloth, meaning slowness, indolence, or torpor. It passed through Middle English as sloth or sleuth, carrying the same meaning, a deliberate unwillingness to move, to act, or to engage. When European naturalists first encountered the animals in the forests of South America during the 16th and 17th centuries, the name they applied to them was immediate and apparently obvious. These animals moved slowly. They seemed, by human standards, to do very little. The name stuck. The pattern holds across many languages. In German, the sloth is called Faultier, literally lazy animal. In French, it is paresseux, meaning lazy. In Spanish, it is perezoso, with the same meaning. In Portuguese, preguiça. In Romanian, lenish. In Finnish, laiskiainen. All of these names circle around the same concept. Slowness understood as laziness, movement understood as motivation. What none of these names captures, of course, is the fact that the sloth's slowness is not a failure of motivation. It is a highly effective biological strategy. The French naturalist Georges Buffon wrote in 1749 that sloths were the lowest form of existence, an assessment that reflected his failure to understand the animal's actual ecology. A sloth moving at a fraction of a human's walking speed through the canopy is not failing to do something it should be doing. It is doing exactly what its physiology and environment require. The name sloth also gives us the 7th deadly sin of the same name, accidia, in Latin, a theological concept referring to spiritual apathy, or the failure to apply oneself appropriately. The animal and the sin share a name in English, and this shared etymology has contributed to centuries of mild mischaracterization. The sloth has been portrayed in illustrations and stories as emblematic of a moral failing. Contemporary understanding of sloth biology has gradually shifted this framing. The sloth is increasingly described in scientific literature not as a slow animal, but as an efficiently calibrated one. Its metabolic rate, its sleep patterns, its dietary choices, and its movement speed are all internally consistent. There is no excess anywhere. The animal uses precisely what it needs and conserves the rest. By that standard, it is not lazy at all. It is extraordinarily well managed. We have touched on this already, but it is worth returning to in more detail because the ecosystem that exists within sloth fur is one of the more quietly remarkable features of this animal. The outer coat of a sloth's fur is composed of long, coarse guard hairs. Each of these hairs has a distinctive texture, longitudinal grooves running along its surface. Under a microscope, these grooves are visible as fine channels running from the base to the tip of each strand. These channels are not smooth. They are rough enough to provide purchase for very small organisms. 2 species of blue-green algae, Trichophilus welkeri and Cyanoderma bradypodis, are the primary colonizers. These algae are found in sloth fur and virtually nowhere else in nature. They are, in this sense, obligate symbionts of the sloth. They depend on the sloth's fur as their habitat in a way that no other substrate provides. The algae give the sloth's fur a greenish cast, particularly in the humid forest conditions where moisture encourages algal growth. This coloration is effective camouflage. A sloth hanging in the canopy, its greenish-gray fur dappled with the filtered light coming through the leaves above, is genuinely difficult to see. The eye passes over it. The harpy eagle, hunting by sight from above or below, must look carefully to distinguish sloth from foliage. Beyond the algae, the fur hosts, moths, beetles, ticks, and mites. The sloth moth, several species of which Cryptosis canopi is perhaps the best known, is found exclusively on sloths. These moths live in the fur as adults, feeding on the algae and secretions there. When the sloth descends to the ground to defecate, the moths take the opportunity to lay eggs in the fecal deposit. The larvae develop in the droppings, then emerge as adults and fly back up to the nearest sloth. This cycle is entirely dependent on the sloth's behavior. The relationship between the moths and the algae in sloth fur appears to be genuinely mutualistic. The moths, by living in the fur and depositing nitrogen-rich material there, may be fertilizing the algae, contributing nutrients that support algal growth. Better algal growth produces a more effective green camouflage for the sloth, and if sloths do ingest algae during grooming, a more nutritious supplement as well. The sloth, by descending to the ground on a regular schedule, enables the moth's reproductive cycle. This 3-way relationship, sloth, moth, and algae, is a self-contained system. Each party contributes something to the others. The sloth provides a habitat and a transport mechanism. The moths provide nutrients for the algae. The algae provide camouflage for the sloth and food for the moths. It is a small and complete economy, carried slowly through the forest on the back of an animal that appears, from a distance, to do very little. The ticks, beetles, and mites that also inhabit sloth fur have less clearly defined roles. Some are parasitic to a degree, feeding on the sloth's blood or skin. Others may be largely neutral in their effects. The total community of organisms associated with sloth fur includes species that are still being described by scientists. The diversity within this small mobile habitat is not yet fully cataloged. Despite moving slowly and consuming leaves quietly in the canopy, sloths occupy a significant role in the ecosystems they inhabit. As we noted earlier, in some well-studied forest sites, sloths constitute a majority of the arboreal mammal biomass. This means that if you were to add up the weight of all the mid-sized mammals living in the trees of a given forest, sloths would account for a substantial portion of that total. Their numbers across the rainforests of Central and South America run into the millions. And because they are so numerous, the things they do, however slowly, accumulate into a significant ecological effect. Sloths are browsers. They consume leaves, buds, and sometimes flowers and fruits. In doing so, they exert a gentle but continuous pressure on the trees they feed from. The effect is usually minor for any individual tree. A sloth does not consume large amounts. But across a population of sloths over time, the browsing pressure shapes the composition of the canopy, favoring trees that can tolerate light leaf loss. The periodic descent to the ground for defecation, which we have discussed in terms of its energy cost to the sloth, also has an ecological dimension. A sloth deposits its fecal material at the base of its motile tree. This material contains the partially digested remains of leaves, nutrients that have passed through the sloth's long digestive process and been made more available to soil organisms. There is a hypothesis, though not conclusively proven, that sloths may be actively fertilizing the trees they prefer, depositing nutrients near the roots of the same trees they depend on for food. If true, this would be a form of low-level mutualism between sloth and tree. The broader nutrient cycle is also relevant. A sloth's body eventually becomes a resource. When a sloth dies in the canopy and falls to the forest floor, the organisms in its fur, the algae, the moths, the beetles, dispersed into the surrounding forest. The sloth's body itself becomes food for scavengers and decomposers. Nothing is wasted. Sloths also serve as prey. They are consumed by harpy eagles, large owls, ocelots, jaguars, and anacondas, among other predators. Their role as prey species places them within the food web, contributing energy upward to the animals that eat them. Because sloths are relatively numerous, they represent a reliable resource for these predators. The ecosystem of the tropical rainforest is dense with interdependencies. The sloth is not a keystone species in the way that some animals are. The forest would not collapse without sloths, but the forest would be different without them. It would have a different distribution of leaf browsing pressure, a different structure of nutrient deposition, a different population of organisms adapted specifically to sloth fur. The sloth, unhurried and often invisible, is woven into the fabric of its ecosystem in quiet but real ways. It is somewhere deep in the night, in a lowland rainforest in Costa Rica. The air is warm and humid. The darkness is not complete. The forest receives enough reflected light from the sky that shapes are still visible. The upper canopy, 30 or 40 meters above the ground, is a dark mass of interlocked branches and leaves. Below it, successive layers of vegetation descend toward the forest floor, which is relatively clear of undergrowth. The canopy above is too dense for much sunlight to reach the ground. Somewhere in the middle canopy, perhaps 15 meters up, a three-toed sloth is hanging from a branch. It has been in roughly the same position for several hours. Its claws are locked around the branch, its head tucked down against its chest, its body still. It is sleeping, or close to sleeping. At this hour, the forest is not silent. Insects produce a continuous background tone, a layered hum of crickets and katydids, punctuated by the calls of frogs from somewhere near the stream to the east. Occasionally, the sound of something larger moving through the undergrowth, a peccary perhaps, or an armadillo rooting in the leaf litter. High in the canopy, a nightjar produces its irregular call, then stops. The sloth does not respond to these sounds. Its hearing is adequate, but not particularly acute. Its eyesight is poor in low light. In this dark, warm, noisy forest, it is essentially invisible and unreachable. The harpy eagle that poses the greatest threat to it during daylight hours is roosting somewhere in its own territory, inactive until dawn. For the sloth, the night is the safest time. It is also, for the species at least, a time of potential feeding. As the hours pass, the sloth will rouse itself, not fully, not suddenly, but gradually, and reach for the nearest leaves. Its movements will be slow and deliberate. It will consume a small amount, then hang still again, then perhaps move a short distance along the branch, reach again. This pattern, small increments of feeding, distributed across the night, separated by long periods of stillness, is the rhythm of a sloth's nocturnal hours. It is unhurried in a way that has no equivalent in the lives of faster animals. The sloth does not hurry because there is nothing in its biology that benefits from hurry. The leaves are not going anywhere. The branch will hold. The night is long. Far below, on the forest floor, the sloth's previous visit to the ground has left a small depression in the leaf litter near the base of the tree above. The sloth moths that flew up from the decomposing material there are now distributed through the fur of the animal hanging above. New eggs are being laid in the deposits from the sloth's last visit. The cycle continues, invisible in the darkness. The three-toed sloth will remain in this section of canopy for most of the week. It knows this tree, this cluster of branches, the particular texture of each limb. When it moves, it will follow roots through the canopy that it has used before, reaching for the same vines, crossing the same gaps. Its world is small but intimate. It does not need to be large. There is something worth sitting with in the image of an animal that has developed a way of living based entirely on reduction. Reduction of movement, reduction of energy use, reduction of need. The sloth does not require more than what it has. Its body has been shaped over millions of years into an instrument for occupying the canopy of the rainforest on the absolute minimum required to do so. And in that reduction, there is a kind of completion. Each of the 6 living sloth species has its own characteristics, range, and ecological context. They share the broad features we have been discussing, but it is worth taking each one in turn and noting what makes it distinct. The brown-throated three-toed sloth, Bradypus variegatus, is the most widely distributed sloth species. It is found across much of Central America and the northern and the central portions of South America. This is the species most commonly encountered in studies and wildlife documentaries. And most of what we know about three-toed sloth biology comes from research on this species. It has the characteristic round head, the small eyes, and the faint brown markings on the throat that give it its name. Males of this species have a distinctive patch of orange and black fur on their back, which is absent in females. The pale-throated three-toed sloth, Bradypus tridactylus, is found in the northern portions of South America, particularly in the Guiana Shield region, Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname, and adjacent parts of Brazil and Colombia. It is similar in appearance and behavior to the brown-throated sloth, but has a paler coloration on the throat and face. Its range does not extend as far north as its relatives. The manned three-toed sloth, Bradypus torquatus, is the most geographically restricted of the three-toed sloths. It is found only in the Atlantic forest of southeastern Brazil, a forest that has been substantially reduced in extent over the past several centuries through agricultural expansion and urban development. The man sloth is classified as vulnerable on the IUCN Red List, a reflection of its restricted range and the continued pressure on its habitat. It is distinguished by a distinctive mane of coarser, darker fur around the head and neck, more pronounced in males. The pygmy three-toed sloth, Bradypus pygmaeus, lives only on Isla Escudo de Veraguas, a small island off the Caribbean coast of Panama. It was formally described as a distinct species only in 2001. It is smaller than the other three-toed sloths, with shorter fur, and it is found almost exclusively in the red mangrove trees along the island's coast. Its population is very small, likely fewer than 100 individuals, and it is classified as critically endangered. Linnaeus's two-toed sloth, Chalepus didactylus, is one of two two-toed species. It is found across a large portion of northern South America, extending from Venezuela and the Guianas through the Amazon basin. It is slightly larger than most three-toed sloths and, like all two-toed sloths, has only 2 claws on each front foot. Two-toed sloths tend to be somewhat more active than three-toed sloths and are more likely to be found moving through the canopy during the day, though they are still primarily nocturnal. Hoffman's two-toed sloth, Chalepus hoffmanni, has a somewhat disjunct range, found in Central America and in a separate population in the Andes and western Amazon of South America. It is the most studied of the two-toed sloths in terms of social and reproductive behavior, partly because it is relatively common in certain research sites in Costa Rica. It is similar in appearance to Linnaeus's sloth, but tends to occupy slightly different forest habitats and food trees. Despite the differences among these 6 species, they all share the fundamental characteristics that define sloths: the arboreal lifestyle, the slow metabolism, the curved claws, the inverted resting posture, and the leaf-based diet. They are variations on a single, highly specialized theme. Humans have had awareness of sloths for as long as people have lived in the forests of Central and South America. Indigenous communities across the region developed their own names, stories, and relationships with the animals they shared habitat with. And the sloth, visible, distinctive, and sometimes accessible, would have been a known presence. In many indigenous traditions of the Amazon basin and the forests of Central America, the sloth carries symbolic associations related to patience, stillness, and the slow passage of time. It appears in oral traditions and material culture in various forms, though the specifics vary widely by culture and region. When European naturalists first arrived in South America during the 16th century, the sloth was among the animals that most confounded their expectations. European natural history had developed a framework based largely on the animals of Europe and Asia, animals that moved, that hunted or fled, that behaved in recognizable ways. The sloth did not fit this framework well. It seemed to early observers to be perpetually ill or dying. Francisco Hernandez, a Spanish physician who documented natural history in Mexico and Central America in the 1570s, described the sloth in terms of its apparent suffering. Others speculated that it must have some defect, some pathology that explained its slowness. This mischaracterization persisted in European natural history for a long time. The names assigned to the sloth in various European languages, as we have noted, were rooted in the concept of laziness or inadequacy. It took centuries of more careful observation and, eventually, physiological research to establish that the sloth's apparent inactivity was a coherent and successful biological strategy. In more recent centuries, the sloth has become a recognizable figure in popular culture across many parts of the world. It is a common subject of wildlife photography and nature documentaries. Its face, with the round head, small eyes, and what appears to be the mild upward curve of the mouth, is often described as smiling, though this is a feature of its anatomy rather than an emotional expression. This apparent expression has contributed to the sloth's popularity in media, merchandise, and internet culture. Zoos around the world maintain sloth populations, which allows people in temperate regions to observe these animals directly. The presence of sloths in zoos has supported research into their biology and has contributed to public awareness of their conservation status. The sloth's cultural journey, from misunderstood curiosity in 16th century European natural history to a maligned symbol of a deadly sin to a beloved and meme-friendly internet presence, is itself a reflection of how human understanding of the natural world has changed over time. We now understand the sloth well enough to appreciate it on its own terms. An animal that is found through millions of years of evolution, an extraordinarily efficient way to live in a specific and demanding environment. The conservation status of the 6 sloth species varies considerably. 4 of them, the brown-throated 3-toed sloth, the pale-throated 3-toed sloth, Linnaeus's 2-toed sloth, and Hoffman's 2-toed sloth, are currently classified as least concern on the IUCN Red List. Their populations are considered stable enough that they do not require urgent intervention in most of their range. The manned 3-toed sloth is classified as vulnerable. Its restriction to the Atlantic forest, which has been reduced to roughly 12% of its original extent, places it under consistent pressure. The Atlantic forest is one of the world's most fragmented large forests, and ongoing habitat loss and degradation affect the manned sloth's ability to maintain viable populations across its range. The pygmy 3-toed sloth is critically endangered, with a population likely numbering fewer than 100 individuals on a single small island. It is among the most restricted large mammals in the world. Its conservation situation is closely tied to the integrity of the island's mangrove forest, which itself faces pressures from sea level rise and human access. For the 4 least concerned species, the primary long-term concerns are habitat fragmentation and the expansion of human infrastructure into forest areas. Sloths do not adapt well to forest fragmentation because they cannot easily cross open ground between forest patches. When a continuous forest is divided into smaller isolated blocks by roads, agricultural land, or urban development, sloth populations in those blocks become genetically isolated from each other. Over generations, inbreeding can reduce genetic diversity, and with it, the the population's resilience, the illegal wildlife trade presents an additional pressure. Sloths, because of their apparent docility and appealing appearance, are sometimes taken from the wild to be kept as pets or used in tourist photography operations. Both practices are generally harmful to the animals involved. Sloths do not adapt well to captive conditions outside of professional zoological care. They require specialized diets and environmental conditions that are difficult to replicate in informal settings. And the stress of handling and confinement is significant for animals accustomed to stability. Various conservation organizations operate across the range of sloths, working on habitat protection, rehabilitation of injured animals, and research. The Sloth Conservation Foundation, based in the United Kingdom, focuses specifically on sloth research and community-based conservation in Costa Rica and Panama. Several wildlife rehabilitation centers in Costa Rica receive significant numbers of sloths injured by electrical contact or traffic and work to return them to suitable habitat. The long-term outlook for sloths as a group depends substantially on the fate of the tropical forests they inhabit. The Amazon basin, the Central American forests, and the remnants of the Atlantic forest are all subject to various degrees of pressure from land use change. The trajectory of those pressures will shape the trajectory of sloth populations over the coming decades. For now, in large portions of their range, sloths continue to live much as they have for millions of years, hanging in the canopy, eating leaves slowly, sleeping long hours, descending to the forest floor once a week, and carrying their small ecosystem of algae and moths through the forest, one deliberate arm reach at a time. In the early afternoon, in a section of forest in the lowlands of Ecuador, the light that reaches the canopy is filtered and soft. The sun is past its highest point, and the angle of the light creates a warm, amber tone, where it comes through gaps in the leaves above. A brown-throated three-toed sloth has positioned itself in the upper branches of a cecropia tree. Cecropia trees grow quickly and often appear at the edges of forest clearings or in areas where other trees have fallen. Their large, pale-bottomed leaves are easy to identify, and the sloth has been visiting this particular tree for several days. At this hour, the sloth is not feeding. It is resting, not exactly sleeping, but in a state of quiet inactivity. Its head is tilted back slightly, its face turned toward the gap in the canopy above, where a patch of direct sunlight comes through. The sunlight warms the dark fur on its back. The sloth's body temperature, which dropped during the cool night, is rising slowly toward its comfortable range. This is thermoregulation. The sloth is using the sun's warmth the way a reptile does, absorbing heat from the environment rather than generating it internally. It will remain in this position for perhaps an hour or two. When the light shifts, or when the temperature in the sun patch becomes too warm, it will move into shade. This small adjustment, sun to shade, shade to sun, is one of the more active things a sloth does on a typical afternoon. Below, in the forest understory, a pair of tanagers moves through the mid-level branches, chasing insects. They pass the cecropia tree without stopping. A troop of squirrel monkeys moves rapidly through the canopy in the distance, their calls sharp and frequent, then gone. The sloth does not move. From a distance, the sloth is not easy to see. The greenish tint to its fur blends with the mottled light in the canopy. The shape of its body, pressed against the branch, reads as part of the tree. A person standing below, looking up, might notice something that seemed to not quite match the branch. A slightly irregular mass, a different texture, and look more carefully and still not be certain they had found an animal. This is not coincidence. The camouflage is effective because it has been shaped by selection over a very long time. Every sloth that was easier to see was more likely to be taken by a hawk or a cat. Every sloth that blended more effectively into the canopy was more likely to survive and to pass on whatever made it less visible. Over millions of generations, this process produced an animal whose appearance is functionally inseparable from its habitat. The afternoon passes. The treetops in the distance shift slightly as a breeze moves through the upper canopy. Though below the first layer of leaves, the air is nearly still. The sloth does not notice the movement. It remains where it is, absorbing warmth, its claws passive around the branch, its metabolism ticking along at its unhurried pace. Later, when the light begins to fail and the forest shifts from afternoon to evening, the sloth will stir. It will begin to feed. It will move, slowly, to a new branch. The night will open up around it, rich with sounds, dark and warm. And the sloth will spend the next several hours doing what sloths do, eating leaves, a few bites at a time, and resting between them. This is an ordinary day. Once approximately every 6 to 8 days, a sloth descends from the canopy to the forest floor. This is one of the more studied behaviors in sloth biology, partly because it is one of the most energetically costly and potentially dangerous things a sloth does. The descent takes time. On a trunk that might take a squirrel a few seconds to traverse, a sloth may spend 20 or 30 minutes. It moves downward in slow, deliberate increments, releasing one claw, lowering, gripping again. The forest floor eventually rises to meet it. On the ground, the sloth's limitations become clear. Its long forelimbs and shorter hind legs, ideal for hanging, do not support upright walking. The sloth pulls itself along the forest floor with its forelimbs, the body dragging, the hind legs providing some push but little stability. It moves slowly even by sloth standards. A resting ground speed of around 1 meter per minute is typical. The purpose of this descent, for most observed animals, is defecation. The sloth scrapes a small depression in the leaf litter or soil near the base of its preferred tree and deposits a substantial quantity of material there, the accumulated result of several days of digestion. The sloth's stomach has been processing this material slowly the entire time. What is deposited contains much of what entered the stomach days earlier, broken down and fermented to various degrees. The scientific discussion around why sloths do this, descend to the ground rather than depositing waste from the canopy, has produced multiple hypotheses over the years. Fertilizing the base of the mottle tree is one. Supporting the reproductive cycle of sloth moths is another. A third and more recent hypothesis suggests that this behavior is simply a holdover from terrestrial ancestors, one that has not been abandoned because the costs, while real, are not high enough to have driven its elimination. The moths' hypothesis has attracted considerable attention. The cycle by which sloth moths lay eggs in the fecal deposits, their larvae mature there, and the adults then fly back up to the sloth, is well enough established that it constitutes a genuine mutualism, and some researchers have demonstrated that the moths contribute nitrogen to the fur ecosystem in ways that support algal growth. If algal growth improves the sloth's camouflage, and if the sloth benefits nutritionally from ingesting algae, then the ground visit, as costly as it appears, may be indirectly contributing to the sloth's survival through this chain of relationships. After completing the deposit and performing a brief toileting behavior, the sloth begins the long climb back up. This ascent, like the descent, is unhurried. The sloth grips the trunk, pulls itself upward, reaches for the next grip. It may take half an hour or more to reach the canopy again. Once there, it returns to the familiar cluster of branches, settles into position, and resumes its resting state. The entire episode, descent, ground visit, ascent, may consume a significant portion of the sloth's daily energy budget. For an animal that manages energy as carefully as the sloth does, this is a notable expenditure. The fact that this behavior persists, despite its cost, is itself informative. It suggests that whatever benefit it provides, whether through moth algae, mutualism, soil fertilization, or some other mechanism not yet fully understood, is sufficient to sustain it. Among the facts about sloths that tend to surprise people, their swimming ability is perhaps the most counterintuitive. An animal that moves at less than 1 kilometer per hour through the trees, that is largely helpless on the ground, and that appears to resist almost any form of active movement. This same animal, when placed in water, moves with reasonable efficiency. The mechanics of sloth swimming are straightforward, though the physiology behind them is interesting. Sloths use a modified form of motion in water, pulling with the forelimbs in a diagonal stroke, while the body remains buoyant and relatively horizontal. The long arms, which are a disadvantage in terrestrial locomotion, become functional paddles in water. The sloth's body is naturally buoyant. The relatively low muscle mass and the air trapped in the fur contribute to this, and it does not need to expend much effort to remain afloat. In terms of speed, sloths in water move significantly faster than on the ground. Some estimates suggest they can swim at speeds roughly 3 times their ground movement rate. This is still slow by most animal standards, but it represents a meaningful difference and suggests that swimming is not an emergency response, but a viable mode of movement. Sloths in the wild have been observed entering water voluntarily. In regions where forest patches are separated by rivers, sloths will sometimes swim across. This is particularly relevant to dispersal, the movement of individuals away from their birth area into new territory. For a sloth, crossing a river by swimming may be more efficient than attempting to find a path around it through fragmented ground-level habitat. The capacity for swimming also raises interesting questions about sloth evolutionary history. The ancient Glenarthran lineage that gave rise to modern sloths included, as we noted earlier, some forms that appear to have been semi-aquatic. The genus Thalassocnus, found in the fossil record of the west coast of South America, shows a progressive series of adaptations toward marine life across successive species. Changes in the limb bones, the density of the skeleton, and the teeth that suggest an increasingly aquatic lifestyle. These marine sloths are believed to have fed on seagrass and seaweed in shallow coastal waters, somewhat like modern sea cows in their ecological role. Today's tree sloths are not aquatic in any meaningful sense. They do not seek out water. They do not feed in it. and they do not appear to prefer habitats near water, except when forest fragmentation makes swimming useful. But the ability is there, vestigial perhaps, but functional, and it connects modern sloths to a much broader range of ecological possibilities than their current canopy-dwelling life might suggest. There is also the matter of injury resistance, which we touched on earlier but is worth returning to. Sloths have been documented surviving falls from height, deep bite wounds from predators, and other injuries that would typically be serious for mammals of their size. Their skin is notably tough. Their low body temperature may reduce infection rates, as many bacterial pathogens grow most efficiently at temperatures closer to 37 degrees Celsius, the typical mammalian core temperature that sloths rarely reach. Perhaps most remarkably, sloths have been observed remaining, hanging on a branch after death. The passive grip formed by the claws and tendons does not release when the animal dies. A sloth that has died in the canopy may continue to hang there for some time before falling. This is an unusual situation among mammals. Most animals fall immediately upon death, and it reflects just how completely the sloth's anatomy is organized around passive suspension. We are nearing the end of this long exploration of the sloth, and it seems appropriate that we end, as the sloth does, in stillness. Somewhere in the canopy of a lowland rainforest, in Peru perhaps, or along the Pacific slope of Costa Rica, a Hoffman's two-toed sloth has settled into the fork of a large strangler fig. It has been in this position since before dawn. Its claws are locked, its eyes are closed, its breathing is slow and shallow. The forest around it moves through its ordinary rhythms. Birds calling at first light, the heat building through the morning, the brief afternoon rains, the cooling of evening. The sloth is part of this rhythm, but it is also somewhat apart from it. It moves through time at its own pace, which is slower than the pace of most of the life around it. Its days are not structured around the urgencies that structure the days of other animals. There is no territory to defend against active competitors, no prey to track, no flight response triggered by every sound in the undergrowth. The sloth's life from the outside looks like an extended pause. From the inside, insofar as we can reason about such things, it is something else entirely. The sloth is processing. Its stomach is working through material it consumed 2 nights ago. Its muscles are maintaining the passive tension that holds its grip. Its algae are photosynthesizing in whatever light filters through the canopy to its fur. Its moths are going about their slow cycle. The sloth is not inactive. It is just operating on a different time scale. We have covered a great deal of ground in this recording. We have moved through the sloth's classification, its physical characteristics, its habitat and geographic range. We have followed the structure of its day, the slow feeding, the long sleep, the weekly descent to the ground. We have looked at its physiology, the low metabolic rate, the variable body temperature, the efficient grip that requires no muscle effort to maintain. We have explored its fur ecosystem, its reproduction, its evolution, and its place in the cultures and conversations of the humans who share its world. All of these threads lead back to the same central image, an animal hanging quietly in the canopy, green-tinged and still, surrounded by the full complexity of the tropical forest existing on the absolute minimum that existence requires. There is no moral to draw from this. The sloth is not a teacher. It is not a symbol. It is a mammal, shaped by tens of millions of years of evolutionary history, occupying a specific ecological niche in a specific part of the world. But it is a useful thing to hold in the mind when the pace of other things, faster things, louder things, seems like too much. The sloth hangs. The leaves above it move gently in whatever small air currents find their way into the canopy. The light changes as the hours pass, and the sloth remains where it is, patient in a way that requires no effort, still in a way that is entirely natural. The forest continues around it. The night will come again, and the sloth will be there, exactly where it is now, turning its face toward whatever warmth remains. Rest well, high in the canopy of the same forest where sloths spend their quiet days. Another animal occupies a very different position in the ecosystem. The harpy eagle is one of the largest eagles in the world, and the sloth is among its most important prey items. The harpy eagle, Harpia harpica, is a bird of the neotropical forests. Adults can have a wingspan of up to 2 meters, and the females, which are larger than the males, can weigh up to 9 kilograms. The bird hunts in the forest canopy, using a combination of powerful flight and extraordinary vision to locate and take prey. Its talons are among the largest of any eagle, capable of gripping animals as large as sloths and monkeys. The relationship between harpy eagle and sloth is ancient. For millions of years, as sloth lineages diversified and spread across the Americas, large raptors were part of the landscape those sloths had to navigate. The sloth's primary defense, camouflage and stillness, is specifically effective against visual predators hunting from above or below. A harpy eagle hunting for sloths operates primarily by slow, patient scanning. It perches high in the canopy and watches for movement or for any slight visual irregularity that might indicate an animal concealed in the foliage. The sloth's greenish fur, its motionless resting posture, and its habit of pressing close to branches all reduce its visual signature to a hunting eagle. An eagle may be scanning the same section of canopy as a resting sloth and not detect it. When detection does occur, the eagle attacks rapidly. It drops from its perch and strikes with its talons, gripping the sloth with enough force to penetrate the fur and hold. The sloth's claws and relatively tough skin can provide some resistance, and sloths have been documented surviving eagle attacks with significant claw injuries. But in most cases, a harpy eagle strike is successful. The sloth has no active response to aerial predation in the way that many prey animals do. It does not flee, it cannot outrun a strike, and it cannot fight effectively against an eagle of this size. What it has is concealment. The strategy is not response, but prevention, being invisible rather than escaping from detection. This asymmetry, the sloth's passivity versus the eagle's activity, has shaped sloth behavior over evolutionary time. The sloth's preference for the middle and upper canopy, where dense foliage provides cover, is partly an anti-predator adaptation. Its tendency to descend to sunlit spots only briefly and to retreat into shade during the middle of the day when aerial predators are most active reduces exposure time. On the ground, the sloth faces a different category of predator. Jaguars and ocelots are both capable of taking sloths on those rare occasions when sloths are at ground level. Ocelots are more common than jaguars in many sloth habitats and are active at night, which overlaps with the timing of some sloth ground visits. The sloth's vulnerability on the ground is real, though, as noted earlier, actual predation events during ground visits appear to be relatively uncommon. Uncommon enough, at least, that the behavior has been maintained despite the risk. Anacondas present a third category of predator. These large constricting snakes are capable of taking sloths that come within reach near water or in low vegetation. Given that sloths are swimmers and occasionally enter rivers, encounters with anacondas in riparian habitats are possible. Documented cases are not numerous, but the potential exists. What is notable across all of these predatory pressures is that the sloth's response to all of them is essentially the same: stillness and invisibility. The sloth does not have a suite of different behaviors for different threats. It has one deep adaptation, concealment, that serves across contexts. In the canopy, that adaptation works very well, and most sloths live their lives without being taken by predators. The Cecropia is a genus of trees found throughout the tropical forests of Central and South America. There are more than 60 described species in the genus, and they occur across a wide range of lowland and montane habitats. They are among the most ecologically significant trees in the Neotropical region, not because they are the largest or the oldest, but because of the roles they play in forest succession and in the diets of so many animals. Cecropia trees are pioneer species. They are among the first trees to colonize disturbed or open areas, clearings created by fallen large trees, roadsides, riverbanks, agricultural edges, and areas where fire or flooding has created a break in the canopy. They grow quickly, reaching several meters in height within a few years, and they have large, deeply lobed leaves with a distinctive silver-white underside. From a distance, a stand of Cecropia trees is recognizable by the shimmer of those pale leaf undersides catching the light. The three-toed sloths of the genus Bradypus feed preferentially on Cecropia leaves. In areas where Cecropia is abundant, three-toed sloths are commonly found in or near these trees. The leaves of Cecropia are less chemically defended than those of many other tropical tree species. They contain fewer of the toxins that make some leaves difficult for sloths to digest. They are also relatively large, which means a sloth can obtain a significant amount of material from a small number of movements. The relationship between three-toed sloths and Cecropia is not exclusive. Sloths feed on other species as well, but it is close enough to be ecologically significant. In forests where Cecropia is common, sloth population densities tend to be higher. In forests dominated by tree species with more chemically defended leaves, sloth densities are often lower. Two-toed sloths are less specific in their dietary preferences than three-toed sloths. They feed on a wider range of tree species, including leaves, buds, flowers, and occasionally fruits. This dietary flexibility may be one reason why two-toed sloths can persist in a somewhat broader range of habitat types. The Cecropia has its own set of ecological relationships beyond its association with sloths. It is an important food source for a wide range of birds and mammals: toucans, parrots, monkeys, and bats among them. Many of these animals are attracted to the fruits, which are small and produced in dense clusters. The seeds of Cecropia are widely dispersed by animals that consume the fruits. There is also a well-known relationship between Cecropia and certain species of ants. Some Cecropia trees house colonies of Azteca ants in hollow chambers within their stems. The ants benefit from the food and shelter the tree provides, and in return, they defend the tree against herbivores and competing plant species. This ant-plant mutualism is one of the more studied examples of symbiosis in neotropical ecology. The sloth, feeding on Cecropia leaves, exists within this web of relationships. It consumes material produced by a tree that is simultaneously housing ants, feeding birds, and colonizing clearings. The sloth's fecal deposits at the base of the tree return some of that material to the soil. The tree grows. The sloth returns. In forests where large trees have been cleared, Cecropia often colonizes the disturbed edges and gaps. Sloths in fragmented habitats sometimes persist in these secondary forest patches, feeding on the abundant Cecropia that grows there. This gives the three-toed sloth some resilience to moderate habitat disturbance. As long as there is some Cecropia and some canopy for cover, the sloth can maintain a basic existence. Where disturbance is more severe and where continuous forest is replaced by open fields or monocultures, the Cecropia does not persist either, and neither does the sloth. Most of the mammals that share the sloth's forest are faster than it is, a great deal faster, by any standard measure. A squirrel monkey moves through the canopy at speeds that make the sloth's pace seem geological by comparison. A peccary can cover several kilometers in a single night of foraging. A jaguar can accelerate to a run in less than a second. Even the tapir, one of the more unhurried large mammals of the neotropical forest, moves at a pace that would leave a sloth far behind. The sloth is the slowest moving mammal on Earth by most measurements of sustained travel speed. This fact is often presented as a curiosity, a biological record of sorts. But the more interesting question is what slowness makes possible, what the sloth can do or avoid doing by being this slow. One thing it avoids is detection. The visual systems of many predators are sensitive to movement. An animal that moves slowly and infrequently in a complex and movement-rich environment like a tropical forest canopy becomes very difficult to track. The predator's visual system is calibrated for motion. A motionless or nearly motionless object, especially one that matches the color and texture of its surroundings, produces no trigger. The sloth's slowness is not a compromise. It is a feature. Another thing slowness avoids is energy expenditure. Movement is metabolically expensive. Every step a fast-moving animal takes requires muscular work, which requires energy, which requires food, which requires more movement to find. The sloth has stepped off this treadmill. By reducing movement to the absolute minimum, it has reduced its energy requirement to the absolute minimum, which means it can survive on a food source, leaves, that provides less energy per gram than almost any other available diet. This is not a strategy available to all animals. It requires a specific convergence of conditions, a food source that is reliably available in large quantities, a climate warm enough to support a low metabolic rate, a canopy structure that can be navigated without speed, and a predator guild that hunts by sight rather than by scent or hearing. The neotropical rainforest provides all of these conditions. The sloth has exploited them with remarkable precision. There is also something to be said for the durability of slowness. Fast animals wear out. They sustain more injuries. They use more resources. They live faster and often die sooner. The sloth's low energy existence is correlated with an apparently long lifespan. An animal that is largely invisible to predators, that rarely sustains injuries from high-speed movement, that digests its food over days rather than hours, and that sleeps most of the day. Such an animal can persist for decades in conditions that would exhaust a faster organism. The sloth is not a compromised or failed version of a faster animal. It is the outcome of a different optimization. Where most mammals optimize for speed, mobility, and metabolic throughput, the sloth has optimized for efficiency, concealment, and longevity. Both approaches work. The sloth and the jaguar share the same forest, both successful, neither needing to become the other. The neotropical rainforest is one of the most acoustically rich environments on Earth. During the day, the forest is layered with sound. In the upper canopy, parrots and toucans produce calls that carry long distances. Howler monkeys, which are among the loudest land animals in the world, produce low, resonant roars that can be heard kilometers away. Smaller birds, tanagers, flycatchers, wood creepers, fill in the middle frequencies with more complex and variable song. Insects sustain a background tone of clicks, buzzes, and sustained vibrations across a wide range of pitch. At night, the composition shifts. Birds become largely quiet or are replaced by nocturnal species like nightjars and owls. Frogs take over much of the soundscape, particularly in humid areas near water. Some calling in brief, sharp pulses, others sustaining long tones that fill the lower frequencies of the night air. Insects continue through both day and night, though different species dominate at different hours. The sloth moves through this soundscape passively. Its hearing is adequate, but not particularly specialized. It is not, by most accounts, an animal that relies on hearing for its primary interactions with the environment. It does not track prey by sound. It does not respond to most of the sounds around it with behavioral changes. There are two exceptions. The first is the vocalization of the three-toed sloth female, that high, thin whistle used to attract mates. This call, which carries a considerable distance, is produced specifically to be heard by sloths. Males who hear it will orient toward the source and move, however slowly, in that direction. The sloth's hearing may be specifically tuned to the frequency range of this call in a way that other environmental sounds do not trigger. The second exception is the sounds of immediate physical threat. The approach of a large bird, the scrabbling of a predator on a branch. Sloths have been observed responding to sudden, close sounds with a slight alerting response, a raising of the head, a tightening of the grip, a pause in whatever activity was occurring. This is a basic mammalian threat response, and it serves the sloth's primary defense, freezing in place. Beyond these two specific triggers, the sloth appears to filter most of the forest sound out. The enormous acoustic richness of the tropical rainforest passes over and through the sloth without producing observable behavioral changes. The howler monkeys calling in the next tree, the parrot flocks crossing above, the constant insect background, all of this reaches the sloth's ears and registers in some way, but does not move it. There is something restful in this image, an animal surrounded by the full orchestral complexity of one of the richest ecosystems on Earth, hanging quietly in the middle of it all, apparently undisturbed by the scale of the sound. The sloth is not indifferent to the world around it. It is alive to its specific cues, filtered precisely for what matters to its survival. Everything else it has learned over evolutionary time to let pass. To understand where the sloth has come from, it helps to imagine the world it evolved in, a world that no longer fully exists, but whose traces persist in the fossil record. 12,000 years ago, the Americas were home to a different suite of large mammals than those found today. In North America, mammoths and mastodons ranged across the plains and woodlands. Giant bison occupied the grasslands. Horses and camels, both of which originated in North America, were still present on the continent. The dire wolf, a large canid, hunted in packs across multiple biomes. The American lion, larger than modern African lions, ranged across open habitats. Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat, was a major predator. In South America, the diversity was equally striking. Giant armadillo-like creatures called glyptodonts wandered the grasslands, their shells forming domed structures several meters long. Toxodon, a large rhino-like mammal, grazed in open areas. Macrauchenia, a strange camel-like creature with a short trunk, also occupied South American grasslands. And everywhere in this landscape, in forests and at forest edges and in open country, there were sloths. The ground sloths were not a marginal part of this Pleistocene fauna. They were major components of it. In South America, multiple families of large ground sloths occupied different ecological niches, some browsing on shrubs and low trees, others feeding on higher vegetation by rearing up on their hind legs, others perhaps digging for roots or tubers. In North America, where the ground sloths had arrived through the Isthmus of Panama connection that formed around 3 million years ago, species like Jefferson's ground sloth inhabited forests and woodland edges from the tropical south to the boreal north. The giant Megatherium lived alongside all of this. At 4 tons or more, it would have been able to use its immense claws to pull branches down, and its sturdy build to topple smaller trees to access their crowns. It was an engineering force in the landscape, as elephants are today, capable of modifying the structure of the vegetation around it through its feeding activities. This world ended rapidly. The Pleistocene megafauna of the Americas, the full suite of giant mammals that had populated the continents for millions of years, largely disappeared within a few thousand years after the arrival of human hunters from Asia via the Bering Land Bridge. The extinction was not instantaneous, and it was not universal. Many smaller animals survived, and a few larger ones managed to persist in limited areas. But the pattern of loss was severe and unprecedented in scope for the Americas. The sloths that survived were those already in the trees. The small arboreal forms that occupied the tropical forest canopy, the ancestors of today's 6 species, were less accessible to human hunters than the ground-dwelling giants. They were harder to locate, harder to approach, and possibly less worth hunting given their small size. Whatever the precise reasons, they persisted while their relatives did not. What we see when we look at a sloth today is, in a sense, what is left of one of the great mammalian radiations of the Cenozoic. The sloth's lineage produced, over tens of millions of years, an extraordinary diversity of forms ranging from elephant-sized giants to small tree dwellers. The giant forms are gone. What remains are the small survivors, the canopy specialists who, by chance or adaptation, were in the right place when the world changed. The sloth's digestive system is built for a specific challenge, extracting energy from leaves that don't want to give it up. Leaves are an abundant resource. In the tropical rainforest, they are everywhere, year-round, requiring no hunting and no pursuit. But they have evolved to discourage eating. Plants cannot run from herbivores, so they have developed chemical and physical defenses. Thick cell walls made of cellulose and linen that are difficult to break down, and chemical compounds including tannins, alkaloids, phenolics, and terpenoids that reduce palatability and can cause physiological harm in sufficient quantities. To utilize leaves as a primary food source, an animal needs either a highly specialized digestive apparatus or the capacity to select among leaf species to minimize exposure to harmful compounds. Sloths do both. The sloth's stomach is large relative to its body size. It is divided into multiple chambers, and the entire structure is designed to hold and process large volumes of material slowly. Resident microbial communities, bacteria, and other microorganisms perform much of the actual breakdown work. These microbes ferment the plant material, releasing volatile fatty acids and other compounds that the sloth can absorb as energy. This fermentation process is similar in principle to what occurs in the rumen of cattle and other ruminant mammals, though the anatomical arrangement is different. The process is genuinely slow. The time from ingestion to elimination in sloths can be several days. Some estimates suggest that material may remain in the digestive system for 5 to 7 days under normal conditions. The stomach is rarely empty. It contains a continuous succession of material in different stages of processing. Because digestion is so prolonged, the sloth must manage the timing of its feeding carefully. It cannot consume a large meal quickly and then wait for it to process. Instead, it feeds in small increments continuously, maintaining the flow through its digestive system without overwhelming it. The stomach's contents at any given time may account for roughly 30% of the sloth's total body weight, a substantial proportion that reflects the slow turnover. The choice of which leaves to eat is therefore important. Three-toed sloths, which are more dietary specialists than two-toed sloths, tend to focus their feeding on tree species with relatively lower chemical defenses. They learn these preferences partly through their mothers, as we discussed, and partly through direct experience over time. Two-toed sloths are more flexible eaters. They consume a wider range of plant species, including some with higher levels of chemical compounds, and they appear to have somewhat greater physiological tolerance for dietary variation. Two-toed sloths are also more likely to supplement their leaf diet with other materials, fruits, flower buds, occasional invertebrates, and even small vertebrates have been reported. This dietary flexibility is consistent with the two-toed sloth's more variable habitat use. The teeth of sloths reflect their dietary habits. They have no incisors, the front-biting teeth present in most mammals. Instead, they have hardened lips that function as shearing surfaces, cropping leaves close to the stem. Further back in the mouth, they have simple, low-crowned molars that grind plant material. The teeth grow continuously throughout the sloth's life, compensating for wear. This continuous growth is an adaptation to a diet of abrasive plant material that would eventually wear down a fixed set of teeth. The combination of a slow-acting fermentative stomach, a tolerance for plant chemical compounds, a careful selection process for low-defense plant species, and continuously growing teeth creates a digestive system that, while limited in throughput, is highly reliable in a forest full of leaves. Tropical rainforests are among the most important carbon stores on Earth. The plants and trees of these forests absorb carbon dioxide during photosynthesis, incorporating carbon into their wood, leaves, and roots. This stored carbon remains in the living biomass of the forest for as long as the trees and plants live, which in mature tropical forests can be centuries or even millennia for the largest trees. The role of animals in this carbon cycle is less immediately obvious, but still significant. Animals consume plant biomass, process it through their digestive systems, and return carbon to the environment in various forms. Through respiration, through excretion, through decomposition of their bodies after death. The patterns of this consumption and return shape how carbon moves through the forest ecosystem. Sloths, as among the most abundant arboreal mammals in the forests they inhabit, participate in this carbon cycling in ways that scale up with their numbers. A population of sloths consuming and processing several kilograms of leaves per animal per week across a forest of millions of square kilometers represents a substantial flow of material. The sloth's contribution is not dramatic in the way that a flood or a fire changes carbon dynamics. It is continuous and distributed, a steady browsing pressure on the leaf biomass of the canopy, a steady return of processed material to the soil through fecal deposits, a steady accumulation of sloth biomass that itself represents stored carbon. The fecal deposits at the base of mottle trees are particularly interesting in this context. Sloth feces contain partially digested leaf material, microbial biomass from the digestive system, and various chemical compounds. When deposited on the forest floor, this material is consumed by decomposers, soil organisms, bacteria, and fungi. That process it further and release its components back into the soil as nutrients. The nitrogen and phosphorus in sloth feces becomes available to plants, including the trees that produced the leaves the sloth ate. Whether this constitutes a meaningful fertilization effect for the trees specifically chosen as mottle trees is a question that has not been answered definitively. But the general principle that sloth waste contributes to forest nutrient cycling is consistent with what we know about how nutrients move through these ecosystems. There is a broader point here about the relationship between animal communities and forest health. Forests do not exist as purely botanical systems. The animals that inhabit them are participants in the processes that maintain forest structure through herbivory, through seed dispersal, through nutrient return, through the physical modification of habitat by large animals. The sloth's contribution to all of these is modest in scale, but consistent in application. And over the long periods of time across which forests develop, consistency matters. The sloth's image in popular culture has shifted considerably over the past several decades, and the trajectory of that shift is, in some ways, a reflection of broader changes in how people relate to the natural world. For most of recorded history, sloths were known primarily to people who lived in or near their range. In Europe and other parts of the world, the sloth was an exotic curiosity, occasionally depicted in natural history texts and illustrations, described with varying degrees of accuracy. Early European descriptions, as we noted, often cast the sloth in negative terms, emphasizing its apparent slowness and inactivity as defects. This characterization persisted in popular literature and art through the 19th and early 20th centuries. The sloth appeared occasionally in fiction and imagery as a symbol of laziness, sloth being one of the 7 deadly sins, and the association between the animal and the theological concept was difficult to separate. The rise of wildlife television in the mid to late 20th century began to change this. Nature documentaries that showed sloths in their actual habitat, hanging in the canopy, moving through the forest, raising young, presented them in an observational light that allowed audiences to see the animal on its own terms rather than through a moral framework. The sloth began to be described not as defective, but as specialized. The internet era accelerated this shift dramatically. Video footage of sloths, their slow movements, their apparent expressions, their behavior when handled by rehabilitators, spread rapidly across social media platforms, beginning in the 2000s and 2010s. The sloth became one of the more popular animal subjects in internet culture. Videos of baby sloths in rehabilitation, of sloths swimming, of sloths reacting slowly to various stimuli, accumulated hundreds of millions of views. This popularity has had mixed effects. On one hand, it has raised awareness of sloths as interesting and engaging animals, which may translate into support for conservation efforts. Organizations working on sloth conservation have benefited from the increased public interest in the animals. On the other hand, the popularity has contributed to a problematic demand for sloth encounters. Tourist operations offering close contact with sloths, holding, photographing, or interacting with animals that have been taken from the wild or habituated to human contact have increased in some parts of Central America. Wildlife organizations working on sloth conservation consistently note that these operations are harmful to the animals involved, regardless of how they are presented. The sloth's appeal is not difficult to understand. Its apparent expression, the upward curve of its mouth that reads as a smile to human observers, combined with its slow, deliberate movements and large eyes, creates an appearance that many people find charming. These are human projections, of course. The sloth's facial structure is anatomical, not emotional, and its movements are physiological necessity, not personality. But the appeal is real, and it has made the sloth one of the more recognized and discussed wild animals in contemporary popular culture. Isla Escudo de Veraguas is a small island. It lies in the Caribbean Sea off the coast of Panama's Bocas del Toro province, about 17 kilometers from the mainland. It is roughly 4 kilometers long and covered in dense tropical vegetation, with mangrove forests lining much of the coastline and mixed tropical forest in its interior. On this island, and nowhere else in the world, lives the pygmy three-toed sloth, Bradypus pygmaeus. The pygmy sloth was formerly described as a distinct species only in 2001, though it had been observed and collected earlier. Its distinctness from the brown-throated three-toed sloth of the mainland was initially not recognized because the two animals looked broadly similar, but morphological and genetic analysis eventually confirmed that the island population represented a separate lineage, isolated long enough to have diverged in size, fur length, and other characteristics. The pygmy sloth is smaller than mainland three-toed sloths by a meaningful amount, approximately 30 to 40% less body mass. This is an example of insular dwarfism, a phenomenon observed in many animal lineages when island populations become isolated. On islands, the selection pressures that favor large body size on continents, competition for resources, predation by large carnivores, are often reduced or absent. In their place, pressures favoring smaller body size can dominate because smaller animals require less food and can sustain themselves on the more limited resources of an island. The pygmy sloth lives almost exclusively in the red mangrove trees, Rhizophyra mangle, that grow along the island's coastline. These trees, with their distinctive arching prop roots that extend from the trunk into the shallow water, create an unusual and somewhat constrained habitat. The pygmy sloth moves among the mangrove branches, feeds on their leaves and buds, and rests in the same posture as all other sloths, hanging still, blending into the vegetation. The island's small size, the sloth's restricted habitat within that island, and the extremely limited population, perhaps fewer than 100 individuals by recent estimates, make the pygmy sloth one of the most precariously situated mammals in the world. Its entire global population fits within the mangrove fringe of a small Caribbean island. It has no range elsewhere, no other population to draw on. The threats to the pygmy sloth are not dramatically different from those facing other sloths: habitat disturbance, human encroachment, the disruption of the mangrove system. But the consequences of any significant disturbance are amplified by the sloth's extreme restriction. A storm that damaged the mangroves significantly, a disease event, a period of intensive hunting, or a sustained degradation of the island's habitat could affect the entire global population of the species simultaneously. Conservation organizations working on the pygmy sloth have faced the challenge of limited access and limited resources. The island is protected as part of a national marine park in Panama, which provides some degree of legal protection. Monitoring the population has been difficult because the mangrove habitat makes observation challenging, and the sloth's low density means that systematic surveys require considerable effort. The pygmy sloth is an extreme case, but it illustrates in concentrated form the vulnerability of any animal whose range is small and whose habitat is specialized. The sloth's evolution produced, among its outcomes, this small island specialist, a creature that has spent thousands of years adapting to a single small island in the Caribbean. Whether that specialization will prove durable over the coming century depends on factors that extend well beyond the island itself. The relationship between a sloth and heat is unlike that of most other mammals. Homothermy, the maintenance of a stable internal body temperature through metabolic heat production, is one of the defining characteristics of mammals as a class. Most mammals invest considerable metabolic energy in maintaining their core temperature within a narrow range, regardless of the ambient temperature. This costs energy, but it confers flexibility. A homeothermic mammal can be active in a wide range of environmental temperatures because its internal chemistry is always operating at the same temperature. The sloth is an incomplete homeotherm. It is technically classified as heterothermic. Its internal body temperature varies more than that of a typical mammal, fluctuating with the ambient temperature in a way that is more typical of reptiles than mammals. The sloth's body temperature ranges roughly between 25 and 35 degrees Celsius, depending on the time of day and the surrounding conditions. During cool nights, its temperature may drop toward the lower end of this range, slowing its metabolism further. During warm afternoons, particularly when the sloth is basking in direct sunlight, it approaches the upper end. This variability is an energy-saving measure. Generating metabolic heat to maintain a constant high temperature requires burning fuel. Food. The sloth, which survives on a low-calorie leaf diet, does not have fuel to spare for this. By allowing its temperature to vary with the environment, it reduces the metabolic cost of thermoregulation. The consequence is that the sloth must manage its position relative to sunlight carefully. In the early morning, when the air is cool and the sloth's temperature is low, it will typically position itself in sunlit patches, climbing to the outer edge of the canopy, orienting toward the sun, holding still while its body warms. This basking behavior is directly analogous to what reptiles do, and it serves the same function, using environmental energy rather than metabolic energy to reach a functional body temperature. As the day warms and reaches its hottest point in the early afternoon, the sloth may move into shade. Overheating, while less immediately dangerous than excessive cooling, can stress the animal and increase its need for water, which is obtained primarily from leaves. This thermoregulatory strategy constrains the sloth's geographic range. A mammal that cannot reliably warm itself through metabolism is limited to environments where ambient temperatures remain warm enough to support activity. The tropical rainforest, with its stable, warm temperatures, is ideal for this purpose. At higher altitudes, where temperatures drop significantly, or in seasonal environments with cold winters, the sloth's thermoregulatory strategy would fail. The animal would cool too much during cold periods and be unable to maintain even its minimal level of activity. There is an interesting implication here for climate. As global temperatures shift, the range of conditions experienced within tropical forests will change. For an animal as tightly coupled to ambient temperature as the sloth, even modest changes in local temperature patterns could affect activity levels, reproductive timing, and the energetic balance of daily life. Research on the potential effects of climate change on sloth physiology and behavior is ongoing, though the complexity of these interactions makes prediction difficult. For now, in the warm stability of the lowland neotropical forest, the sloth's relationship with temperature remains a quiet daily negotiation. A morning move into sunlight, an afternoon retreat into shade, a night spent cooling slowly as the forest air dropped a few degrees toward dawn. The story of sloth moths is a small, complete story within the larger story of the sloth. Several species of moth have evolved a life history entirely bound to the sloth. The best studied belong to the genus Cryptosis, though other genera are also involved. These are small moths, not the large, showy moths of temperate forests, but compact, pale-winged insects that spend their adult lives within the dense, coarse fur of a sloth. As adults, sloth moths do not feed. They do not leave the sloth, except for one specific purpose. When the sloth descends to the ground to defecate, that periodic, energy-costly journey we have discussed, the moths travel down with the sloth or fly directly from the fur to the fecal deposit. There, the females lay their eggs in the fresh material. The eggs hatch into larvae that develop in the deposit, feeding on the organic material there as it decomposes. When they complete their development and reach adulthood, the moths fly back up into the canopy and find a sloth. Ideally, the same sloth, though other individuals will serve. Back in the fur, the adult moths go about their lives. They move among the hairs, feeding on algae and secretions. They live for some weeks or months, depending on the species. They mate within the fur, and when the sloth next descends to defecate, the cycle begins again. This life history is unusual, even by the standards of parasitic and commensal insects. The moths have essentially outsourced all of the most energetically costly parts of their life cycle to the sloth. The sloth carries them safely through the canopy, protected from most predators. The sloth provides them with food in the form of algae. The sloth's regular defecation behavior provides them with a reliable substrate for reproduction. The sloth is, for the moth, both habitat and transport and resource. In return, the moths may provide real benefits to the sloth. Their presence in the fur adds nitrogen-rich material, waste products, and shed exoskeleton to the sloth's coat. This nitrogen fertilizes the algae that grow in the fur's grooves. Better nourished algae grow more abundantly, producing a denser and potentially more effective green camouflage. If the sloth also ingests algae during grooming, better algal growth means more nutritional supplement. The scientific evidence for this chain of mutualism is not complete in all its links. Some connections are inferred from indirect evidence rather than direct demonstration, but the pieces fit together in a way that makes the entire system coherent. The sloth, the algae, and the moths form a three-party relationship in which each contributes to the conditions that sustain the others. There are other invertebrates in sloth fur, beetles, ticks, and mites of various species, and some of these may have their own, less fully studied relationships with the sloth and with the moth-algae community. The fur of a sloth is a habitat complex enough that its full ecology has not yet been mapped. New species associated with sloths are still being described. This is worth sitting with for a moment. A single animal, moving slowly through the forest, carries on its back a community of organisms, some of them known to science only from sloth fur, that have no existence independent of the sloth. Their world is the sloth. Their entire ecological context, food, shelter, climate, reproductive substrate, is provided by one animal. And that animal moves through the forest carrying them, unaware of the complexity it supports. It is late in the night. The forest has moved through its full daily cycle. The morning light, the midday heat, the afternoon rain, the cooling of evening, all of these have passed, and what remains is the deep quiet of the tropical night, a few hours before dawn. The canopy is dark. In the middle layers of the forest, where a pale-throated three-toed sloth has been feeding for the past several hours, The branches are visible only as shapes against the slightly less dark sky above. The sloth's greenish fur is invisible. The sloth is invisible. It has moved in the past 3 hours, perhaps 15 meters along a series of connected branches. This constitutes a significant portion of its nightly range. In those 15 meters, it has eaten perhaps 200 or 300 grams of leaf material, small bites from a succession of stems, pausing between each to hang still, grip firm, head slightly lowered. The forest around it has been active throughout the night. Frogs near the stream have been calling continuously, a background presence that does not diminish as the night deepens. An owl called from somewhere in the adjacent forest earlier, then was quiet. The rustling of a porcupine moving through the understory came and went. These sounds registered in the sloth's awareness at some level, then passed without response. Now, in the final hours of the night, the feeding has slowed. The sloth is hanging in the fork of a branch, arms over the upper limb, body suspended below. Its grip is passive. Its breathing has slowed. The night's feeding has added a modest increment to what is already in its stomach, and the digestive process will work through the night and into the day without any further effort on the sloth's part. In a few hours, as the first light begins to separate sky from canopy, the sloth will move toward a position where the morning sun will reach it. It will do this slowly, an hour or more, before the light actually arrives, as though it knows, through some low-level sensitivity, to the changing quality of air and the first, almost perceptible lightening of the darkness. That warmth is coming. It will be in position when the sun clears the horizon, and the first direct light comes through the canopy gap it has learned over months and years of visits to this section of forest is worth occupying at this hour. And then the cycle will begin again. The morning warm-up, the midday rest, the afternoon rain, the evening, the night. The leaves will be there. The branches will hold. The fur will maintain its green tinge. The moths in the fur will go about their small business. The sloth will move through it all at the pace its physiology requires, which is slower than almost anything else moving in the same forest, and which is exactly right for what the sloth is. There is nothing about this that needs to be different. The sloth is complete. Its relationship with its environment is not a work in progress. It is the outcome of an optimization that has been running for millions of years, and it works. The sloth is here because it works. Let the image settle. A slow animal in a warm forest carrying a small ecosystem on its back, hanging in the dark. The night continues. The forest breathes. The sloth holds on. We have covered a great deal of ground in this recording. If you have been listening for a long time, or if you are returning to this material from a place of partial sleep, it may be useful to move through the basic outlines of the sloth once more, slowly and without urgency, as a way of letting the information settle. The sloth is a mammal. It belongs to a group called Synarthra, along with armadillos and anteaters. There are 6 living species, divided into 2 families, the 3-toed sloths and the 2-toed sloths. These 2 families are not closely related. They arrived at their similar forms through convergent evolution, independently. All 6 species live in the lowland tropical forests of Central and South America. None of them live anywhere else in the wild. They occupy the canopy of these forests, moving slowly among the branches, hanging from them for most of their lives, feeding on leaves and buds. The sloth's defining characteristic is its slowness, and that slowness is the result of its low metabolic rate. The sloth processes energy slowly because it eats low-calorie leaves. It must conserve the energy it has by moving as little as possible. This is not a limitation. It is a strategy, and a successful one. The sloth sleeps for 15 to 20 hours a day. When it is awake, it feeds on nearby leaves. It descends to the ground approximately once a week to defecate. It basks in sunlight to warm its body. It carries on its fur a community of algae, moths, beetles, and mites that depend on it for their existence. The sloth is well camouflaged. Its greenish-tinted fur blends with the dappled canopy. It moves so infrequently that even careful observers often overlook it. This camouflage is its primary defense against the harpy eagles and large cats that would otherwise prey on it. Baby sloths are born alert, with eyes open and claws ready to grip. They spend their first 6 months to a year clinging to their mother's body, learning which leaves are safe to eat by sampling the residue of her meals. When they leave their mothers, they inherit a portion of the familiar home range. Sloths have a long evolutionary history. Their ancestors were ground-dwelling animals, some of them giant, the size of elephants. These ancient ground sloths disappeared approximately 12,000 years ago, along with most of the large mammals of the Americas. What survived were the small arboreal forms that have given rise to the 6 species alive today. The name sloth comes from an Old English word meaning laziness or torpor. In most European languages, the sloth's name has similar meanings. But the sloth is not lazy. It is efficient. It lives on the minimum energy required, does exactly what its environment and physiology allow, and does so consistently and successfully. 4 of the 6 species are currently stable in terms of conservation status. The manned 3-toed sloth is vulnerable, restricted to the degraded Atlantic forest of Brazil. The pygmy 3-toed sloth is critically endangered, found only on a single small island off the coast of Panama. The sloth hangs in the canopy. The forest continues around it. Time passes slowly. This is the sloth. We have reached the end of this long recording, and there is nothing left to do but rest. The sloth we have been visiting in the forests of Costa Rica and Ecuador and Peru, in the mangroves of Panama, in the secondary forest edges where cecropia grows, in the upper canopy where harpy eagles scan and where morning sunlight comes through the gaps. That sloth is still there. It has not moved far since we started. It has eaten a little, rested much, and continued its slow negotiation with gravity and sunlight and leaves. If you are still awake, you have traveled a considerable distance tonight, through taxonomy and ecology, through evolutionary history and behavioral biology, through the lives of animals that no longer exist, and the lives of animals that do. The sloth has served as a guide for all of it, not because it moves quickly through these subjects, but because it sits quietly at the center of them, unchanged by our attention. If you have fallen asleep somewhere along the way, that is also good. The sloth of all animals would understand this. It would not judge. The forest does not end when this recording ends. The canopy continues to hold whatever it is holding. The moths continue their cycle. The algae continue to grow in slow grooved hair. The sloth continues to hang. There is something in the sloth's existence that does not require witness to be real. It has been doing what it does for far longer than any human has been present to observe it. And it will, in all likelihood, continue doing what it does long after this recording has been listened to many times and set aside. The world moves at many different speeds. The fastest things, particle interactions, neural signals, the beating of a hummingbird's wing, pass in fractions of a second. The slowest things, the movement of tectonic plates, the accumulation of soil, the evolution of a species, unfold across millions of years. The sloth sits somewhere in the middle of this range, moving slowly but measurably, living its quiet life in real time. Let the pace of this recording carry you a little way toward the slower end of things. Let the image of the canopy, warm and dark and full of slow sound, be the last thing your mind holds. The sloth is there, holding on, quietly, in the dark. Good night. To fully appreciate the sloth, it helps to appreciate the world it lives in, the canopy of the tropical rainforest, which is one of the least understood and most biologically rich environments on Earth. The canopy is not a single layer. In a mature tropical rainforest, there are multiple distinct vertical zones, each with its own set of conditions and its own community of inhabitants. The tallest trees, the emergents, rise above the general canopy surface, sometimes reaching 50 or 60 meters. Their crowns are isolated and exposed, subject to wind, rain, and direct sunlight. Below them, the main canopy layer forms a more continuous surface at 20 to 30 meters, a shifting sea of interlocked treetops that intercepts most of the sunlight, falling on the forest. Below that is the understory, shade-adapted trees and shrubs growing in the dim, humid air beneath the canopy. And at the very bottom, the forest floor, covered in decomposing leaf litter, roots, and low-growing shade plants. The sloth lives primarily in the main canopy and occasionally in the lower reaches of the emergent zone. This is a world defined by certain physical realities. Light is available but variable. Patches of direct sun move across the canopy as the earth turns, and the quality and intensity of light in any given spot changes through the day. Humidity is high throughout. The dense vegetation traps moisture, and temperatures rarely vary more than a few degrees from their daily average. Wind is reduced in the canopy interior, though the crowns of emergent trees experience more air movement. The structural complexity of the canopy is extraordinary. No two trees grow exactly the same way, and the branches of neighboring trees overlap and interlock in irregular patterns. Vines, lianas, drape between trunks and connect trees that might not otherwise be accessible to each other. Epiphytes, bromeliads, orchids, ferns, mosses cover many branches, adding additional layers of texture and microhabitat. In some mature forests, the sheer mass of epiphytes on individual trees can equal the mass of the tree's own leaves. For a sloth, this complexity is both habitat and resource. The interlocking branches and vines allow movement without ever touching the ground. The overlapping crowns provide shade and concealment. The dense vegetation reduces the visual range of aerial predators. The variety of leaf types, at different heights and in different light conditions, provides a mosaic of feeding opportunities. Other inhabitants of the canopy include birds of many species, from small tanagers gleaning insects from leaves to toucans moving between fruiting trees. Monkeys traverse the canopy at high speed, filling the air with calls and movement. Insects are everywhere: beetles, butterflies, ants, caterpillars, in densities that would be difficult to estimate. Frogs and lizards occupy the branches and the epiphytes. Snakes hunt in the mid-canopy and understory. In this dense community of life, the sloth occupies a specific role: slow, steady, largely invisible browser. It is not the most conspicuous member of the canopy community. It is not the loudest or the most active, but it is, as we have noted, often the most abundant in terms of total biomass. The forest holds it, and the sloth holds to the forest in a relationship that has persisted essentially unchanged for a very long time. Water is everywhere in the tropical rainforest. It falls from the sky almost daily in the wet season, and in the dry season, which in most lowland tropical forests is a relative term, meaning somewhat less rain rather than actual drought, the humidity remains high. The forest is saturated with moisture in a way that few other terrestrial environments can match. For the sloth, water is obtained primarily through its diet. Leaves and other plant material contain substantial amounts of water. In fresh leaves, water content can be 60 to 80% of total weight. A sloth consuming several hundred grams of leaves per day is obtaining a significant quantity of water passively without needing to descend to streams or water holes. This is convenient because the sloth's movement on the ground is slow and awkward, and the ground level of the forest is where many predators are most active. An animal that can meet its water requirements without regular ground visits is better placed to minimize its exposure to these risks. The sloth's leaf-based hydration strategy is therefore another component of its overall low-exposure, low-energy lifestyle. In conditions of sustained drought, which are unusual in lowland rainforest but do occur in some years, and which climate models suggest may become more frequent in some regions, the water content of leaves decreases. Mature leaves in particular can become significantly drier during extended dry periods. For a sloth relying on leaves as its primary water source, this can create physiological stress. The body temperature variability we have discussed also affects water balance. An animal operating at lower body temperatures loses less water through respiration. The exhaled air contains less water vapor when the body is cooler. This is another indirect benefit of the sloth's heterothermic physiology, one that reduces the animal's dependence on active water-seeking behavior. When sloths do encounter open water, a river, a flooded section of forest, a large pool, they enter and swim with apparent ease, as we have discussed. There is no evidence that they drink from open water sources in the way that many mammals do, but this may simply reflect the rarity of documented observation rather than the absence of the behavior. The sloth's diet is moist enough that active drinking may simply be unnecessary in most circumstances. Rain falling on the sloth in the canopy hits its fur and runs off along the reverse direction hairs, channeled away from the body. In very heavy rain, the sloth may become thoroughly wet, and the damp conditions would be expected to promote algal growth further. The relationship between rainfall and the health of the sloth's fur ecosystem is one of the less studied aspects of sloth ecology. The effects of moisture levels on algal growth, moth behavior, and overall fur community dynamics would require careful, controlled observation to quantify. What is clear is that the sloth exists in an environment where water is not a limiting resource in most circumstances, and its physiology reflects this. It has not developed the elaborate water conservation mechanisms that desert-dwelling mammals show. It has instead developed a body that extracts adequate water from a consistently moist diet in a consistently humid environment, a solution that is entirely appropriate to where it lives. The green tint in a sloth's fur is one of its most recognizable features, and it comes from one of the smallest members of the sloth's fur community, algae. The algae that colonize sloth fur are primarily of two types. Trichophilus welkeri is a filamentous green alga. It grows as long, thin threads that weave through the grooves of the sloth's guard hairs. Cyanoderma bradypodis is another algal species associated with sloth fur, along with a range of cyanobacteria and other microorganisms that form a complex microbial community within the fur structure. These algae are not found living free in the forest environment in the same way that typical green algae grow in water or on rocks. They appear to have evolved specifically in association with the sloth's fur habitat, the grooved hairs, the specific humidity and temperature conditions within the fur, and perhaps the chemical environment created by the sloth's skin secretions. In this sense, the sloth's fur has created an evolutionary opportunity that these algae have exploited over a long period of time, producing forms that are specifically adapted to this unusual habitat. The green coloration the algae produce develops most strongly in humid conditions. In the wet season, when rain is frequent and humidity is consistently high, sloth fur often takes on a noticeably greenish appearance. In drier periods, the color may be more muted. Sloths that have been kept in the dry captive conditions often lose the green tint entirely, and their fur reverts to its basic brownish-gray color. The camouflage effect this coloration provides is real, but somewhat difficult to quantify precisely. A sloth in the canopy, viewed from below by a predator, would blend with the general greenish quality of the light filtered through leaves above. Viewed from above by a harpy eagle scanning for prey, the sloth's greenish fur among the green canopy foliage would be less conspicuous than plain brown or gray fur would be. The effect is not perfect concealment. A careful observer can certainly spot a sloth if they know where to look and what to look for, but it reduces the probability of detection by visual predators. The nutritional benefit of algae to the sloth is more speculative. Several studies have noted that sloths groom their fur, and during grooming, they would inevitably ingest algal material. Analysis of sloth algae has found that they contain lipids, fats, that could provide caloric value if ingested. Some researchers have proposed that the algae constitute a meaningful nutritional supplement, particularly during periods when leaf quality is low. Others have been more cautious about this claim. What seems well established is that the algal community in sloth fur is not merely a passive passenger. It contributes to the fur ecosystem by providing food for moths and other invertebrates. It contributes to the sloth's camouflage. It may contribute to the sloth's nutrition, and it has evolved specifically in association with the sloth, in a relationship that has almost certainly been running for millions of years. Since the arboreal sloth lineages first developed their dense, grooved fur in the tropical forests of South America, there is a quality of stillness in a tropical forest at 3 a.m. that is difficult to describe without having experienced it. The sounds are there. The frogs are still calling. The insects have not stopped and somewhere in the canopy, an owl is making a low, repetitive note. But these sounds are part of the stillness rather than a disturbance of it. They are the texture of the quiet, not a disruption of it. In this hour, most of the forest's active daytime inhabitants are at rest. The birds are roosting. The howler monkeys have been silent for hours. The high-speed activity that characterizes the forest during the day, the movement of parrots, the calling of toucans, the rapid transit of monkeys through the canopy, is suspended until dawn. The sloth is awake, or close to it. It has been feeding intermittently through the night, as three-toed sloths often do. Small amounts of leaves, pauses, more leaves. In the 3 hours since midnight, it has consumed perhaps 150 grams of plant material. This will be processed over the next several days. In the meantime, the sloth occupies its branch, its grip secure, its body temperature somewhat below its daytime high. At this hour, in this forest, there is a quality to the night that the word peaceful does not quite capture. Peaceful implies the absence of conflict or tension. What the nighttime forest has is something more positive than absence, a presence, a density of living process occurring simultaneously across millions of square meters of forest, all of it proceeding at its own pace without reference to anything else. The sloth is one small part of this living density. Its algae are photosynthesizing in whatever faint light reaches the fur from the sky above. Its gut bacteria are fermenting the material consumed earlier in the night. Its moths are moving through the fur, going about their invisible business. The sloth itself is hanging, warm enough, fed enough, gripping the branch with the passive certainty of an animal that has never needed to grasp anything urgently. There is a practice, in some contemplative traditions, of paying attention to what remains when the obvious things are removed, when the drama and the urgency and the noise are stripped away. What is left? In the forest at 3 a.m, what is left is the basic fact of life continuing. Countless organisms pursuing their various necessities in a web of interdependence so complex that no single mind could hold all of it at once. The sloth is a part of this web. It holds on, and the web holds it in return. The night passes. The forest breathes. Somewhere nearby, a frog calls once and then is quiet. A moth moves in sloth fur. A leaf falls from somewhere above and takes a long, spiraling time to reach the forest floor. The sloth does not notice any of this. It is attending to what matters to it, which at this moment is nothing in particular. Just the branch. Just the night. Just the slow, reliable continuation of being alive. The sloth is, in a sense, a living thought experiment about energy. Every living organism requires energy to maintain itself, to run its biochemical processes, to repair tissue, to move, to reproduce. Most organisms extract this energy from food and burn it relatively quickly. The energy flows in and flows out, and the organism must continuously replenish its supply. The sloth has taken a different approach. It has reduced its energy requirements to such a degree that a low-quality, low-calorie food source is sufficient to sustain it. It has done this through a combination of physiological and behavioral adjustments, all of which add up to the same thing. The sloth is extraordinarily efficient at living. The metabolic rate of the sloth, roughly 40 to 45% of what would be expected for a mammal of its size, means that a sloth requires less than half the calories per unit time that most comparable mammals need. To put this in concrete terms, a mammal of similar size that maintained a typical mammalian metabolic rate would need roughly 2 to 2.5 times more food per day than a sloth requires. This efficiency has cascading effects. Because the sloth needs so little food, it can survive on a food source, leaves, that is too low in quality for most mammals. Because it needs so little food, it does not need to travel far to find it. Because it does not need to travel far, it does not need the muscular equipment for rapid movement. Because it does not need the muscular equipment for rapid movement, its body mass is kept lower, which reduces the energy needed to move even further. All of these effects reinforce each other in a system that biologists sometimes call a low-energy niche. The sloth has not found a special food source or a special environment. It has found a way to reduce its requirements until the ordinary resources available in its environment, leaves, warmth, branches to hang from, are sufficient. This is a lesson that has implications for how we think about biological success. The typical measures of success in popular discussion of animal behavior, speed, strength, hunting, prowess, are not universal. They are features of particular lifestyles. The sloth's success is measured not in how fast it can move or how effectively it can hunt, but in how long it can persist on minimal resources, how effectively it can avoid detection, and how many offspring it can produce over a long life. By these measures, the sloth is a very successful animal. Its populations, in the forest where conditions suit it, are dense. Its lifespan is long. Its lifestyle is consistent and stable. It does not need the environment to change to accommodate it. It has accommodated itself to the environment with remarkable precision. There's also something worth noting about the relationship between energy and time. The sloth lives slowly, and it lives long. Fast animals often live briefly, burning through energy quickly, sustaining injuries at higher rates, dying in the predatory exchanges that their speed is meant to prevent. The sloth, by declining to participate in the faster pace of most mammalian life, has found a way to persist for decades in a complex and competitive environment. Slowness in this context is not a constraint. It is a form of longevity. The Atlantic forest is one of the world's most biologically diverse ecosystems, and also one of the most threatened. This forest once covered a broad strip along the eastern coast of Brazil, from the state of Rio Grande do Norte in the northeast, down to Rio Grande do Sul in the south, and extending inland in some regions for several hundred kilometers. It is ecologically distinct from the Amazon basin. It developed in isolation from the Amazon for long periods, producing many species found nowhere else. The Atlantic forest has some of the highest rates of endemism, species found only in a single region, of any forest on Earth. Over the past 500 years, the Atlantic forest has been extensively cleared for agriculture, cattle grazing, and urban development. What remains today is estimated at roughly 12 to 15% of the original extent, and much of this remnant is fragmented into small, isolated patches surrounded by farmland and cities. São Paulo, one of the largest metropolitan areas in the world, is located in the heart of what was once Atlantic forest. The manned three-toed sloth, Bradypus torquatus, lives only in this forest. It is found nowhere else. As the forest has been reduced and fragmented, the manned sloth's range has contracted accordingly. Today, it is found primarily in remnant patches in the states of Bahia, Espírito Santo, Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and Minas Gerais. The manned sloth is similar in body size and basic biology to other three-toed sloths, but it is distinguished by its prominent mane, a collar of coarser, longer, darker fur that surrounds the head and neck, particularly pronounced in males. This feature gives the species its common name and makes it identifiable at a distance. Its conservation status, vulnerable, with an estimated population of several thousand individuals, reflects the ongoing pressure on its habitat. The surviving populations are largely isolated from each other, separated by agricultural land and urban areas that the sloth cannot cross. This isolation limits genetic exchange between groups and increases the risks associated with inbreeding over time. Conservation efforts for the manned sloth focus on habitat protection and restoration. Organizations in Brazil work to connect isolated forest patches through the planting of native trees, creating corridors through which sloths and other forest animals can potentially move between areas. These restoration projects require long time horizons. Forest connectivity sufficient for sloth movement takes decades to develop, but they represent the most viable path to maintaining viable manned sloth populations over the long term. The manned sloth also benefits from legal protection under Brazilian environmental law, which designates the Atlantic forest as a permanent preservation area. Enforcement of these protections is uneven across the forest's extent, but the legal framework provides a basis for conservation action. What is striking about the manned sloth's situation is that it reflects a pattern seen across many forest-dependent species in the Atlantic forest. A highly specialized animal evolved over millions of years for a specific habitat, now finding that habitat reduced to a fraction of what it once was. The sloth's slowness, which serves it so well in ecological terms, becomes a liability in the context of rapid environmental change. It cannot relocate quickly. It cannot adjust its habitat requirements. It must persist in whatever forest remains. That forest, though reduced, is not gone. And where it persists, the manned sloth persists within it. Hanging in the canopy, feeding slowly, raising its young, maintaining its ancient connection to one of the most remarkable forests on Earth. If you have been listening for a very long time tonight, you have now spent several hours in the company of one of the quieter inhabitants of the tropical rainforest. We have moved through everything that can reasonably be said about the sloth in a single long recording. What it is, where it lives, how it passes its days and nights, how it feeds and rests and raises its young, how its body works, and how its kind has evolved across tens of millions of years. We have looked at its relationship with eagles and with moths, with cecropia trees and with algae, with the fossil record and with conservation science. The sloth, throughout all of this, has remained exactly what it is, an animal hanging in the canopy of the neotropical forest, slow and still and thoroughly suited to its existence. There is something that does not quite translate into words about the image of a sloth at rest. It is not the drama of a large predator, the speed of a bird in flight, or the social complexity of a primate troop. It is quieter than all of those, and in its quietness it asks for a different kind of attention. Not the attention that tracks movement and anticipates action, but the attention that simply observes, that stays with something long enough to see what it is, rather than what it might do next. The sloth is an expert at that second kind of presence. It does not move toward things. It does not pursue. It occupies its position in the forest with a completeness that requires no commentary. In the forests of Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Venezuela, Brazil. In all of these places, tonight, sloths are hanging in the canopy. Some are feeding slowly. Some are sleeping. Some are warming themselves in a shaft of moonlight that has found its way through a gap in the canopy. Some have just completed the long journey to the ground and are beginning the slow climb back up. Some are carrying new infants on their chests. All of them are doing exactly what sloths do, exactly as they have done for millions of years, in forests that have changed around them and in response to pressures that have come and gone and will come again. The sloth endures not through strength or speed or cunning, but through fit, through the deep fit between what it is and what the forest offers. It needs the forest to be warm and leafy and tall. The forest asks nothing of the sloth except that it continue to be present, browsing slowly, depositing its nutrients at the base of trees, carrying its small ecosystem through the canopy. It is a good arrangement. It has lasted a very long time, and somewhere in a dark tropical forest. Right now, it continues. Rest with that, if you would like. The sloth is still there, in the dark, hanging on. Good night.